At my father's lavish retirement party, he tapped his crystal champagne glass and introduced me to 200 of Chicago's elite by saying, "And this is my daughter Cassidy. No degree, no future, just a freeloader living off the family name." The entire ballroom erupted into mocking laughter. I did not flinch. I just smiled, lifted my glass toward him and said, "Cheers to you, Richard, because this is the last time any of you will ever see me." Then I turned and walked out, leaving the massive room in absolute stunned silence. I am Cassidy, 33 years old, and my family has always measured human worth in tax brackets and Ivy League diplomas. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The air inside the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and roasted duck, but all I felt was suffocating heat. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my father, Richard Barrett, stepping down as the CEO of Barrett Distribution. Instead, he used his moment at the microphone to perform his favorite party trick, completely humiliating me in front of his wealthy colleagues, business partners, and local politicians. I stood near the edge of the stage wearing a tailored suit that my family assumed I bought on a clearance rack. They had no idea it was custom-made in Milan. My father looked down at me from the podium, his face flushed with expensive wine and sheer arrogance. He had spent his entire life building a logistics company, and he demanded perfection from everyone around him. In his eyes, my lack of a college degree made me a stain on his perfect legacy. He thrived on making me the punchline of his jokes to make himself and my older sister look superior. When the crowd finally stopped their cruel laughter, I did not lower my head or run away crying like the scared 20-year-old girl I used to be. I held my ground. I met my father's gaze, directly letting him see the cold certainty in my eyes. I delivered my final toast, turned on my heel, and began walking toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. I had barely made it past the ice sculpture when I felt sharp, manicured nails dig viciously into my forearm. It was my mother, Patricia. She yanked me backward with surprising force, her face twisted into a snarl of panicked rage. "Are you going to throw a massive tantrum like you did 13 years ago when we emptied your college fund?" Patricia hissed, keeping her voice low so the nearby guests would not hear. "We needed that money to pay for Melanie's wedding. I told you then, and I will tell you now, stop being so incredibly selfish. You are making a scene and ruining your father's big night." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. She was wearing a diamond bracelet that probably cost more than my entire tuition would have. 13 years ago, I had been an honors student working 2 part-time jobs only to find out my parents had drained my savings account to fund a lavish destination wedding for my older sister. When I begged them for help to pay my tuition, they told me the business was struggling and I needed to drop out to support the family. I later found out the business was perfectly fine. They just did not want me to outshine their favorite daughter. "Let go of me, Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I am not throwing a tantrum. I am simply taking out the trash by removing myself from your lives." Before Patricia could respond, my older sister Melanie stepped in front of me, blocking my path to the exit. Melanie was the golden child, 35 years old, holding an Ivy League degree and sitting comfortably as a vice president at my father's company. She crossed her arms, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You always have to make everything about you, Cassidy," Melanie sneered. "Dad was just making a harmless joke. But since you want to act like a dramatic child, you can leave." She turned to one of the hotel's security guards standing near the entrance and snapped her fingers. "Escort the freeloader out of the building. She is no longer welcome at our family events." The security guard took a step forward, looking very uncomfortable. I raised my hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Do not bother," I told the guard. "I am already leaving. And Melanie, I promise you, the next time we speak, you will be the one begging for an invitation." Melanie let out a loud, theatrical laugh. "Right. Good luck paying your rent this month without begging Dad for a handout, you uneducated dropout." I did not waste another breath on them. I pushed past my mother and sister, pushed open the heavy doors, and stepped out into the crisp, cool air of the Chicago night. The city lights glowed brightly against the dark sky, and the chaotic noise of Michigan Avenue washed over me. I took a deep breath, letting the toxic energy of my family fade away entirely. I walked down the grand steps of the hotel where a sleek, fully armored black Maybach was idling at the curb. The chauffeur, seeing me approach, immediately stepped out and opened the rear door. I slid into the luxurious leather interior, the silence of the soundproof cabin wrapping around me like a protective shield. My family genuinely believed I was a struggling, worthless failure who could barely afford groceries. They thought they held all the power because they had stolen my education and kicked me to the curb. They had spent the last decade mocking me, entirely unaware that I had spent those years building an e-commerce logistics empire from the ground up. I did not need their degree. I had built a software platform that revolutionized supply chains across the country. As the Maybach pulled away from the curb, leaving the hotel and my toxic family behind, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Jordan, my brilliant business partner and lead acquisition strategist. The message was short, but it contained the power to destroy the entire Barrett family legacy. Acquisition complete. The text read, "You are officially Barrett Distribution's biggest creditor." A slow, genuine smile spread across my face as I stared at the glowing screen. My father thought he was retiring as a king, handing his mighty throne over to Melanie and her husband. He thought his company was safe. He had no idea that his massive commercial debt had just been bought out by an anonymous corporate entity. He had no idea that the uneducated daughter he just humiliated was now the one holding the leash to his entire empire. The game had officially begun, and I was holding checkmate. The leather seats of the Maybach felt like a throne as the car glided effortlessly through the Chicago night. I locked my phone screen, the text message from Jordan burning a victorious image into my mind. I was officially Barrett Distribution's biggest creditor. My father's massive bloated company was entirely at my mercy. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows, letting the reality of my power wash over me. The street lamps reflected off the glass like sparks of a fire I was about to ignite. For 13 years they thought they had buried me. They had no idea they had simply planted a seed. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my penthouse the next day, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported Italian marble. I stood by the window sipping a freshly pulled espresso, looking down at the financial district I practically owned. My supply chain software was currently managing thousands of freight trucks across the globe, generating millions in daily revenue while my family thought I was unemployed. The absolute silence of my home was suddenly broken by my personal cell phone vibrating violently against the granite kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a relentless stream of notifications from the Barrett family group chat. I picked up the device and scrolled through the chaos. Melanie was leading the charge, her text messages a frantic blur of uppercase letters and exclamation points. "You are an absolute disgrace to this family," the first message read. "Dad had to take his blood pressure medication because of your pathetic little stunt last night. You humiliated us in front of the mayor and the entire board of directors." Another message immediately followed. "I hope you enjoyed your dramatic exit, Cassidy, because you are officially cut off. Do not even think about crawling back to us when you get evicted next month." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. Evicted. They still pictured me shivering in the tiny, unheated studio apartment I lived in a decade ago after they stole my tuition money. They had absolutely no concept of the reality that existed outside their fragile, sinking country club bubble. I did not type a response. I did not justify my actions, nor did I hurl insults back at them. I simply tapped the screen, selected the Leave Group option, and permanently blocked every single number associated with my immediate family. The digital silence that followed was absolute bliss. I set the phone face down and walked into my home office where my legal and financial team was already waiting. Desmond, my lead corporate attorney, sat at the head of the conference table. He slid a thick leather-bound portfolio across the polished wood toward me. "The paperwork is completely finalized," Desmond said, his voice crisp and strictly professional. Your holding company officially owns 100% of Barrett Distribution's commercial debt. We bought it for pennies on the dollar. The bank was desperate to offload it. Your father has defaulted on 3 consecutive quarterly payments. The entire logistics company is running on fumes and fraudulent accounting. I opened the portfolio and scanned the documents. The sheer magnitude of my father's financial incompetence was staggering. Richard Barrett had spent the last 5 years taking out toxic, high-interest loans just to keep up appearances. He had leveraged the company warehouses, the delivery fleet, and even his own retirement pension. He was bleeding money to maintain his private club memberships, his leased luxury cars, and his massive suburban mansion. And now I held the leash to all of it. When do we issue the default notices? Desmond asked, leaning forward with a predatory glint in his eye. We can freeze their operating accounts by tomorrow morning. Not yet, I replied, tracing my finger over my father's forged signature on a loan extension document. I want them to feel the walls closing in first. I want them to panic. We tighten the noose slowly. Prepare the asset seizure documents, but do not file them until I give the explicit word. Before Desmond could respond, a sharp, unfamiliar ringtone pierced the quiet air of the office. It was not my primary business line. It was my burner phone, a secure, untraceable number I kept strictly for high-level corporate maneuvers. Only 3 people in the world had this number. I raised a hand to silence the room and answered the call. Cassidy, is that you? The voice on the other end hissed. I recognized the arrogant, slightly nasal tone immediately. It was Jamal, Melanie's husband. Jamal was a 36-year-old African-American man who walked around the corporate world acting like he was invincible. As the chief financial officer of my father's company, he had always treated me like dirt on the bottom of his expensive designer shoes. But right now his polished, condescending demeanor was completely gone. He sounded frantic, breathless, and terrified. How did you get this number, Jamal? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously flat. Never mind how I got it, he snapped, though his voice clearly trembled. I need to see you, today, right now. It is a massive emergency. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, gesturing for Desmond to stay quiet. I do not do family emergencies anymore, Jamal. Did Melanie not tell you I am officially a disgraced freeloader? Listen to me, you arrogant little brat. Jamal growled, his panic morphing into a desperate attempt at intimidation. I need a favor. I need $150,000 in cash by tomorrow morning. I know you do not have it lying around, but you are going to get it for me. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused by his delusion. You are calling the family freeloader to beg for 150 grand. You must be truly desperate. Did you misplace the company credit card, or did my father finally realize you cannot balance a ledger? Shut up and listen, Jamal hissed, his breathing growing ragged and uneven over the receiver. I saw you get into that armored Maybach last night. I saw the custom watch on your wrist. You are playing a dangerous game, Cassidy. I know you are faking this rich lifestyle. You must be mixed up in something highly illegal, or you found some rich old man to sponsor you. I do not care how you are getting the money, but you are going to get it for me. If you do not hand over that cash by tomorrow, I am going to tell Richard and Melanie exactly how you are paying your bills. I will tell everyone you are an escort. I will ruin your little life. A slow, predatory smile spread across my face. Jamal had absolutely no idea he was threatening a woman who could buy and sell his entire existence before lunch. He thought he had me cornered. He thought he was the predator. Are you blackmailing me, Jamal? I asked, my tone dripping with false innocence. I am giving you an opportunity to help your family, he countered, completely missing the lethal danger hiding in my voice. Meet me at the espresso bar on 5th Avenue in 1 hour. Come alone. Bring a commitment for the money, or I burn your world down. He ended the call abruptly. The dial tone echoed loudly in the quiet office. I lowered the phone and looked up at Desmond, who was watching me with intense curiosity. Trouble? Desmond asked, closing his legal pad. I stood up and smoothed out the lines of my tailored blazer, feeling the thrilling adrenaline of the hunt pulsing in my veins. No trouble at all, Desmond. Just the opposite. The chief financial officer of Barrett Distribution is currently attempting to extort me for $150,000 to cover his tracks. The prey is walking directly into my trap. Have my security team pull the car around. I have a coffee date. The Maybach glided to a halt outside an upscale espresso bar in the Gold Coast district, its heavy tires silent against the pavement. I stepped out into the crisp Chicago afternoon air, leaving my security detail in the vehicle with strict orders to wait. I wanted Jamal to feel entirely in control of this meeting. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the rich scent of roasted coffee beans and expensive pastries washed over me. I spotted him immediately in a private corner booth. Jamal was wearing a sharp-tailored suit that screamed new money, tapping his gold Rolex impatiently against the table. He looked up as I approached, his eyes darting to the window where the armored Maybach was parked. A sickeningly knowing smirk spread across his face as he took in my appearance. I have to admit, Cassidy, I did not expect you to show up in a $500,000 car, Jamal said, leaning back and crossing his arms. Melanie told me you were practically living out of a cardboard box. But looking at you now, the designer clothes, the private driver, it makes perfect sense. I slid into the leather booth across from him, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. What makes sense, Jamal? Please, you are a college dropout with no marketable skills. He chuckled, leaning in as if we were sharing a dirty secret. The only way a woman like you affords a Maybach is by finding an older, very wealthy man who likes to pay for pretty company. Do not worry, I do not judge. In fact, your little arrangement is exactly why I called you here today. I folded my hands on the table, feeling the cold metal of my watch against my skin. You said you needed $150,000. Today. Yes, Jamal nodded, suddenly looking nervous. A minor accounting error on my part. A small oversight in the quarterly ledgers at Barrett Distribution. I need cash to patch the hole before the emergency board meeting on Friday. Your father is breathing down my neck, and Melanie is too busy planning her next luxury vacation to notice the roof is caving in on us. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. You have no idea what a massive mess your father has made. Richard's massive ego has completely tanked the company. He took out enormous commercial loans to cover up the declining profits just so he could keep pretending he is the king of Chicago logistics. The man is a dinosaur who refuses to adapt to modern technology. The company is drowning in millions of dollars of bad debt, and his entire retirement pension is tied directly to our sinking stock. If this accounting error of mine gets exposed, the board will look into everything, and the whole house of cards comes crashing down on all of us. So my father drove the company into the ground. I said, maintaining absolute eye contact, and you decided to skim a little off the top before the ship finally sank. Is that right? Do not act so high and mighty with me. Jamal snapped, his face flushing with sudden anger. Just get the money from your sugar daddy. Tell him it is a family emergency. Tell him you need to buy a new purse. I do not care what lies you spin. Just wire me the funds by tomorrow morning to save this family. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold amusement. No. Jamal blinked, clearly shocked by the single syllable. Excuse me, I said no, Jamal. I am not giving you a single dime. Jamal slammed his fist hard onto the table, making the porcelain coffee cups rattle loudly. Several patrons turned to look, but he ignored them, his face contorting with ugly rage. You stupid little girl, you do not get to say no to me. You think you can just walk away from your family when we need you. If you do not give me that cash by tomorrow, I am going straight to Richard and Melanie. I will tell the entire family and all their high society friends exactly how you earn your living. I will broadcast to the whole city that Richard Barrett's youngest daughter is a high-priced escort. I will completely destroy the pathetic little life you have built with your sponsor. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply reached into my designer bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I placed it on the table and slowly pushed it across the smooth wood toward him. What is this? He demanded, eyeing the envelope suspiciously. Open it. Jamal snatched the envelope and ripped the flap open. A stack of high-resolution photographs spilled out onto the table. His arrogant expression completely evaporated, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. The photos were crystal clear. They showed Jamal intimately embracing a young blonde woman outside a luxury condominium complex in Atlanta. "Her name is Chloe, is it not?" I asked, my voice slicing through his silence like a blade. "She is a real estate agent in Atlanta. It seems she really enjoys the expensive designer gifts you buy her using Barrett Distribution corporate funds." Jamal was hyperventilating now, his hands shaking violently as he flipped through the pictures. "How did you get these? This is highly illegal. Keep looking, Jamal. The photos are just the appetizer." He pulled out the next stack of papers. They were detailed certified banking records, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, wire transfers directly linking his corporate access at Barrett Distribution to shell companies registered in his mistress's name. "You did not make a minor accounting error," I stated, leaning forward to ensure he heard every single syllable. "You embezzled $2.5 million over the last 3 years to fund a double life. You stole from my father, you stole from your wife, and you left a paper trail so wide a first-year law student could follow it blindfolded." "Please," Jamal whispered, the threat completely gone from his voice. He looked around the cafe like a trapped animal searching for an exit. "Cassidy, please. If Melanie sees this, she will take everything in the divorce. If Richard sees this, he will have me thrown in federal prison for decades. I will do anything. What do you want?" I reached into my bag one last time and produced a single neatly typed document and a heavy silver pen. "This is a fully drafted legal confession of your embezzlement, complete with the exact dates and routing numbers of the stolen funds. It states that you acted alone to defraud Barrett Distribution." Jamal stared at the document like it was a live grenade. "I cannot sign this. It is an absolute death sentence. Sign this confession of your embezzlement, Jamal, or I send this entire envelope to the IRS and the FBI right now. I have the emails drafted and scheduled to send. You have exactly 30 seconds to decide if you want to walk out of here a free man today or in handcuffs tomorrow." Sweat poured down his forehead, soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. His hand trembled so violently he could barely grip the silver pen I held out to him. But the sheer terror of immediate ruin broke whatever pride he had left. Jamal snatched the pen and hastily scribbled his signature at the bottom of the confession. I calmly retrieved the document, checking the ink before sliding it back into my bag. I stood up from the booth, looking down at the broken, sweating man who had just tried to blackmail me. "Enjoy your coffee, Jamal," I said, turning to leave. "And do not worry about the 150,000. I have a feeling you are going to have much bigger financial problems very soon." By Thursday afternoon, the financial guillotine I had carefully rigged finally dropped. I sat in my office watching the banking alerts roll across my monitors, perfectly timing the collapse of my father's empire. Across town, the reality of their situation hit my mother first. Patricia Barrett was holding court at the Oakbrook Country Club, hosting her weekly charity luncheon committee. Surrounded by the wealthiest wives in Chicago, she grandly signaled the waiter to bring the bill for their 5 bottles of vintage champagne. The total was nearly $4,000. My mother tossed her signature platinum credit card onto the silver tray with a practiced flick of her wrist, expecting the usual fawning gratitude. 5 minutes later, the club manager approached her table, his face tight with embarrassment. He leaned down and whispered that her card had been declined. Patricia erupted. She stood up, knocking over her crystal water glass, and loudly accused the manager of running a faulty machine. She ripped 2 more elite credit cards from her designer wallet and slammed them onto the table. The manager returned moments later, shaking his head. Every single account was completely frozen. Humiliated in front of the very women she spent her life trying to impress, my mother had to flee the dining room, leaving her high society friends to cover the massive bill. At that exact moment, 20 miles away in the executive suite of Barrett Distribution, my father was experiencing his own personal nightmare. Richard Barrett was red in the face, screaming into his desk phone so loudly that his secretary had retreated to the hallway. He was demanding answers from his wealth manager at the bank. The voice on the other end of the line was completely devoid of sympathy. The bank had executed a hard freeze on every corporate and personal account bearing the Barrett name. The massive commercial loan my father had taken out to mask the company's failing margins had been officially called in by the new anonymous debt holder. Richard slammed the phone down and immediately summoned Melanie to his office. My sister marched in clutching a stack of useless financial reports. She tried to project authority, insisting this was nothing more than a banking glitch or a temporary algorithmic error. She complained that Jamal was not answering his phone to fix the issue, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was currently hiding in a cheap motel, terrified of the embezzlement confession I held in my possession. Before Richard could yell at Melanie to actually do her job, the heavy mahogany double doors of his office swung open. Patricia burst into the room, her carefully styled hair slightly unraveled, her face streaked with angry tears. She threw her useless credit cards onto Richard's desk and demanded to know why she had just suffered the ultimate social humiliation at her country club. Richard sank into his leather chair, rubbing his temples. He admitted they were entirely locked out of their money. The company was bleeding cash, the suppliers were demanding payment, and the bank was refusing to issue any emergency lines of credit. They needed a massive injection of capital immediately, or Barrett Distribution would miss payroll by Friday, triggering a total corporate collapse. Panic set in, but instead of looking at their own failures, they naturally shifted the blame. Patricia paced the length of the Persian rug, her mind twisting the situation into a deranged new narrative. She stopped pacing and slammed her hands on Richard's desk, her eyes wide with a sudden toxic realization. "It is Cassidy," Patricia declared, her voice sharp and urgent. "Think about it, Richard. She showed up to your retirement party wearing a $10,000 Rolex. She left in a custom-armored Maybach. She does not have a degree. She has zero marketable skills. The only possible way a girl like her affords that lifestyle is on her back. She is definitely sleeping with a billionaire." Melanie gasped, her Ivy League superiority complex instantly latching onto the vile theory. "Of course she is," Melanie sneered. "That explains the tailored suits and the arrogance. She is just a glorified sugar baby." Patricia leaned closer to my father, her desperation turning into predatory greed. "Richard, if she is sleeping with a high-profile billionaire, that man has bottomless capital. You need to force her to make him bail us out. We can use this to save the company." Melanie smiled, a cold, calculating expression crossing her face. "And if she refuses to ask him for the money, we simply find out who he is. Men with that kind of money usually have wives, board members, and shareholders. We threaten to expose their dirty little affair to the press. We make him pay us for our silence. He writes a check to Barrett Distribution, and our cash flow problem disappears." My father looked between his wife and his golden child. His misogynistic, arrogant worldview simply could not compute the idea that I had built my own wealth. The narrative that I was trading, favors for luxury, fit his reality perfectly. His panic melted away, replaced by the ruthless ambition of a man who viewed everyone as a pawn to be exploited. Richard nodded slowly, a dark smirk forming on his lips. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a private cell phone he used strictly for off-the-books corporate espionage. He dialed the number of a shady private investigator he had kept on retainer for years. When the investigator answered, my father did not waste time with pleasantries. He delivered his orders with absolute chilling precision. "I need round-the-clock surveillance on my youngest daughter Cassidy," he commanded. "Track her car, tap her digital footprint, and photograph every single man she meets. I need absolute proof of the rich older lover she is currently sleeping with. Dig up every piece of dirt you can find on him. Find the billionaire paying her rent, and I will personally squeeze him for every cent I need to save my empire." 72 hours later, my father's hired shadow finally earned his paycheck. The private investigator tracked me to the private dining room of Le Sommet, Chicago's most exclusive 3-Michelin-star restaurant. Marcus Sterling, the formidable CEO of Vanguard Global Banking, took a slow sip of his Cabernet. He looked across the candlelit table, his eyes reflecting absolute professional reverence. "Cassidy," Marcus said, setting the crystal glass down, "your automated logistics software has completely eliminated our secure transit redundancies. You saved Vanguard $40 million this quarter alone. I am prepared to offer you an exclusive 10-year enterprise contract." I smiled, picking up my own glass. I appreciate the offer, Marcus, but my terms for an exclusive contract require a significant equity integration. I do not just want a vendor fee, I want a seat at the Vanguard board table. Before Marcus could respond to my counteroffer, the heavy oak doors of our private dining suite violently burst open. The crash of wood hitting the wall echoed like a gunshot, silencing the soft classical music playing in the background. Patricia and Melanie stormed into the room, flanked by two highly distressed restaurant managers who were desperately trying to hold them back. My mother and sister were dressed in their most aggressive country club attire, dripping in diamonds they could no longer legally afford. Their eyes were wild-dilated, with a mixture of financial desperation and predatory triumph. The private investigator had clearly delivered his report, and they thought they had just cornered their prey. "Is this the man paying your rent?" Melanie shrieked, her voice shrill enough to shatter the expensive stemware. She shoved past a waiter and marched directly to our table, her gaze locked onto Marcus. She looked him up and down with blatant, sneering disgust. "You must be very proud of yourself hiding in a back room with a girl half your age." Marcus froze, his brow furrowing in profound confusion. He looked at me, waiting for an explanation, but I simply sat back in my velvet chair and took a calm sip of my wine. I wanted to let them dig their graves as deep as possible. Patricia stepped up beside Melanie, crossing her arms over her chest. "We always knew you would end up selling yourself, Cassidy," my mother spat, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. "Ever since we took your college fund, you have been looking for an easy way out. But we never imagined you would be this brazen, parading around in a $10,000 Rolex while your actual family is suffering. Your father is facing a banking error that froze all our accounts, and you are busy playing dress-up with your sponsor." Melanie reached into her designer clutch and violently slammed a leather checkbook onto the table right next to Marcus's plate. "Since your sugar daddy is feeling so generous, he can pick up our tab," Melanie sneered, her voice echoing off the acoustic panels. We enjoyed a few bottles of vintage Petrus out in the main dining room while we waited for your little arrangement to wrap up. "It comes to exactly $5,000. Let us see if your sponsor will pay for your real family, you uneducated dropout." The two restaurant managers finally stepped forward, apologizing profusely to Marcus and me, reaching for my mother's arm to escort her out. "Do not touch me," Patricia snapped, swatting the manager away. "We are not leaving until this man writes a check to Barrett Distribution. We know who you are, sir, and we will go straight to the Chicago Tribune with the details of your dirty little affair if you do not bail my husband out of his current financial bind." The silence that followed was absolute. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their delusion hung in the air like toxic smoke. They actually believed they were executing a masterful blackmail scheme. They thought they held all the power. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of embarrassment. I calmly reached into my tailored jacket, pulled out my solid titanium black Centurion card, and held it out to the terrified waiter standing near the door. "Take care of their petty wine bill," I instructed the waiter, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion, "and kindly ensure these two women are permanently banned from the premises." The waiter took the heavy black card with a trembling hand and practically sprinted from the room. Melanie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please," Melanie mocked, placing her hands on her hips. "Did he give you an allowance card? How adorable. You are still a pathetic fraud, Cassidy." Marcus Sterling finally stood up. He did not look like a guilty lover caught in a scandal. He looked like a titan of global finance who had just been deeply insulted by two insignificant insects. He towered over Melanie and Patricia, his silver hair catching the dim light, his jaw set in stone. He did not address them. He turned his imposing gaze entirely to me and gave a stiff, respectful bow of his head. "Madame CEO," Marcus said, his deep voice resonating with absolute authority. "I apologize for this absurd interruption. Your supply chain AI platform just saved my bank millions, and I will not allow your brilliant business dinner to be ruined by these unhinged extortionists. Do you want me to have my private security detail toss them into the street? Or should we simply have the Chicago Police Department arrest them for trespassing and attempted blackmail?" The color instantly drained from Melanie's face. Her smug, condescending smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated horror. She physically stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the plush carpet. Patricia's jaw dropped open. Her eyes darted wildly from Marcus to me, then to the spot where the waiter had just taken my titanium credit card. Her brain was violently misfiring, completely unable to process the words Madam CEO and supply chain AI platform in the same sentence as my name. CEO. Patricia choked out the words, scraping against her throat like sandpaper. What is he talking about? You do not own an AI platform. You are unemployed. I stood up slowly, matching Marcus's imposing height, and braced my hands on the edge of the dining table. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes, letting her see the vast, untouchable empire I had built entirely without them. I own the software platform that controls 30% of the freight logistics in North America, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. I own the penthouse you wish you could afford. And as of yesterday morning, Patricia, my holding company, owns 100% of Barrett Distribution's commercial debt. I am the anonymous creditor who froze your accounts. I am the reason your platinum cards are declining. And I am the reason my father is going to lose his entire company by Friday. While my mother and sister were suffocating under the crushing weight of my reality, in that private dining room across town, my father was miles away, pacing the length of his opulent corner office. The mahogany walls of Barrett Distribution headquarters felt less like a sanctuary and more like a closing tomb. The multiple computer monitors on his massive executive desk displayed nothing but stark, glaring red error messages. Every single operating account, every payroll fund, and every personal offshore stash remained entirely frozen. The silence in the corporate building was deafening. It was the sound of a legacy logistics empire bleeding to death. Richard Barrett took a long, unsteady sip of aged scotch, his hands trembling slightly against the heavy crystal glass. He checked his gold pocket watch for the fourth time in 10 minutes. He was not a man accustomed to waiting. He was a man accustomed to giving orders, snapping his fingers, and watching the world scramble to obey his every whim. Tonight, however, his entire future, his pension, and his freedom depended entirely on the shady private investigator he had hired to tail me. His mind was already spinning a web of ruthless extortion. He was entirely convinced by Patricia and Melanie's twisted theory. He believed I was a desperate dropout playing house with a billionaire. He had already drafted the blackmail demands in his head. He would find out this wealthy man's name, locate his wife, map out his corporate shareholders, and threaten a massive public scandal unless a wire transfer of $50 million magically appeared in the Barrett distribution accounts by morning. The heavy office doors clicked open, breaking the silence, and Vance stepped into the dimly lit room. Vance was a brutal, highly efficient operative who specialized in corporate espionage and high society blackmail. He wore a rumpled dark coat and carried a massive, overstuffed manila dossier tucked firmly under his right arm. He did not ask for permission to enter, nor did he bother to sit in the leather guest chairs. He walked straight to my father's desk and dropped the heavy file onto the polished wood with a resounding, heavy thud. Richard slammed his scotch glass down, his eyes gleaming with a manic mixture of predatory greed and desperate relief. "Tell me you have it," my father demanded, leaning heavily over the desk, his voice rough with anticipation. "Tell me you found the man. I need a name, Vance. I want photographs. I want dates, times, and bank accounts. If this sponsor is married, I want his wife's maiden name. I need the leverage to force him to bail out this company before the board meets on Friday morning. I am going to squeeze him until he bleeds cash." Vance stood perfectly still, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked down at my father not with the usual conspiratorial smirk of a blackmailer delivering dirt, but with an expression of profound, unadulterated pity. "There is no sugar daddy," Mr. Barrett Vance said, his voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. My father waved his hand dismissively, letting out a sharp, arrogant scoff. He refused to let go of his delusion. "Do not be ridiculous," Richard snapped, pointing an angry finger at the dossier. "I saw her with my own eyes. Cassidy is wearing custom Milanese suits and a $10,000 Rolex. She left my retirement party in a fully armored luxury vehicle. She is a college dropout. We cut off her tuition 13 years ago and threw her out on the street. She has absolutely zero education and zero marketable skills. Women like her do not magically acquire that kind of wealth unless they are sleeping with it. Stop playing games and give me the target. Vance slowly unclasped the thick manila folder and flipped it open. He did not pull out grainy, illicit photographs of me walking into a hotel with an older man. He pulled out certified corporate filings, federal patent registrations, and pages of dense financial disclosures. He spread them across the desk methodically, covering the red error messages flashing on my father's keyboards. "You are not listening to me," Richard Vance said, tapping a thick stack of legal documents with his index finger. I tracked her digital footprint. I traced the license plates on the Maybach. I followed the money through 3 different international shell companies and offshore holdings. There is no older man. There is no illicit affair. Your daughter is the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics AI. Richard stared at the papers, his mind violently rejecting the information. The name Vanguard Logistics AI was legendary in his industry. It was the cutting-edge software platform that had single-handedly revolutionized global shipping routes. Richard had desperately tried to license that exact software 2 years ago to save his own failing delivery fleet, but the corporate vendor fee was entirely out of his price range. He had literally begged his board of directors for the capital to buy the software, completely unaware he was begging for permission to pay his own discarded daughter. "That is impossible," my father choked out, his face rapidly draining of all color. He grabbed the edge of the heavy desk, his knuckles turning stark white. "She does not know anything about logistics. She is an ungrateful child. She is a fraud. She holds 7 international patents on automated supply chain algorithms." Vance countered, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. "She built a routing system that major international banks, global shipping fleets, and federal freight networks rely on every single second of the day. Her platform generates more revenue in a single Tuesday than Barrett Distribution has made in the last decade. Look at the corporate filings, Richard. Look at the signature on the patents. She is not sleeping with a billionaire. She is the billionaire." The expensive scotch in my father's stomach suddenly turned to pure acid. His knees gave out beneath him, forcing him to collapse heavily back into his leather chair. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. The undeniable proof was staring him right in the face. The daughter he had mocked, the child he had publicly humiliated and discarded to protect his own massive ego, had quietly built a global empire, while he had driven his family legacy straight into the ground. His mind frantically scrambled for a lifeline. He was a survivor. He was a master manipulator. If Cassidy was a billionaire, then she was his billionaire. She was his flesh and blood. He could use this. He could easily spin a narrative of a proud, tough, loving father. He could claim he had pushed her to succeed by cutting her off, and now demand a seat on her executive board as repayment. He could force her to inject capital into Barrett Distribution under the guise of a triumphant family partnership. "Fine." Richard breathed heavily, a manic, desperate smile stretching across his pale, sweating face. "Fine. If she has the money, she can save us. She owes me. I gave her the ruthless edge she needed to survive in this world. I will call her right now. I will offer her a minor equity stake in this company in exchange for clearing our current debt. We will rebrand, we will merge the companies." Vance did not move. He did not agree. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his dark trench coat and pulled out one final single sheet of paper. It was a heavily redacted corporate acquisition filing from the Federal Banking Commission. He slid it across the smooth wood, letting it come to rest directly in front of my father's trembling hands. "You cannot offer her equity in this company," Richard Vance said, his tone entirely devoid of any sympathy. "Because you no longer have any equity to give." My father stared blindly at the complex legal jargon on the paper. "What is this?" "I traced the anonymous holding company that bought out all your toxic commercial debt last week," Vance explained, watching the final pathetic fragments of my father's sanity crumble. "I traced the exact entity that issued the default notice and froze your corporate and personal bank accounts this morning." Richard looked up, his eyes wide with pure, paralyzing terror as the horrific reality finally snapped into place. "She is not just rich," Vance said, turning his back and walking slowly toward the office door. "By the way, her corporation just bought out the bank that holds your company's debt. She owns you." Richard sat frozen in his leather chair as the heavy mahogany door clicked shut, leaving him entirely alone in his dimly lit executive suite. The suffocating silence of the room was broken only by the hum of the computer servers and the glaring red error messages illuminating his monitors. His mind, usually a steel trap of manipulation and strategy, violently rejected the reality of his situation. His youngest daughter, the child he had starved of resources, mocked relentlessly, and banished from the family legacy, was the very architect of his destruction. She was not a pawn in a billionaire's game. She was the billionaire. Decades of corporate survival instinct rapidly overrode his paralyzing shock. Richard Barrett was a man who refused to drown even if it meant stepping on his own family to keep his head above water. If Cassidy held the debt, she had the power to forgive it. She was his flesh and blood, and in his distorted worldview, that meant she could be controlled. He frantically grabbed his desk phone, barking desperate orders to his terrified personal assistant. He needed to pivot, and he needed to do it flawlessly. The next morning, the sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse executive suite at Vanguard Logistics AI. I stood at my desk reviewing the final asset seizure protocols for Barrett Distribution. The view of the Chicago skyline was spectacular, a daily reminder of the empire I had built from the absolute bottom. My attention was pulled from the financial readouts when my executive assistant Sarah walked into the office. She was pushing a massive silver utility cart, her face caught somewhere between mild amusement and profound shock. Resting on the cart was an absolutely obscene, towering arrangement of white orchids, imported lilies, and rare blue hydrangeas. It was the kind of aggressive, over-the-top floral display usually reserved for a royal wedding or a state funeral. "These just cleared the lobby security screening, Madam CEO," Sarah said, handing me a thick, gold-embossed envelope. "The courier required a specialized freight elevator just to get them up here. He mentioned the arrangement cost $2,000. I took the envelope, slicing it open with a silver letter opener. The handwriting inside belonged to my father, but the tone was entirely alien. The card read, with sickening sweetness, "To my brilliant daughter, I am so incredibly proud of the massive empire you have built. We have let far too much time pass between us. Let us bridge this gap and unite our strengths. Love always, Dad." I tossed the expensive card directly into the stainless steel wastebasket beneath my desk. The desperation practically radiated from the thick cardstock. It smelled cheaper than the synthetic fertilizer, keeping those exotic orchids alive. My father was bleeding cash. His company was hours away from missing payroll, and he had somehow scraped together $2,000 just to send a physical manifestation of his panic. Before I could instruct Sarah to have the flowers thrown into the incinerator, my private cell phone began to vibrate violently against the glass desk. It was a secure number I had changed multiple times, a line heavily guarded by my corporate security team. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. Richard had clearly deployed his shady private investigator to bypass my security firewalls just to get my direct contact information. I let the call go to voicemail, watching the screen glow until the ringing stopped. 2 minutes later, an audio notification popped up. I tapped the screen and put the message on speaker for the room to hear. Patricia Barrett's voice echoed through my immaculate office, thick with theatrical, breathless sobs. "Cassidy, my sweet, beautiful girl. Oh, I have just been weeping all morning. Your father and I were so completely blind to your genius. We made mistakes, terrible parenting mistakes, but we were just trying to prepare you for the harsh realities of the business world. We thought pushing you away would make you a strong, independent woman, but we never meant to cause you pain. Please, sweetheart, you must know that family is everything. Blood is thicker than any temporary misunderstanding. We are hosting a private healing family dinner tonight at the estate, just us. Melanie is so devastated about her silly little outburst at the restaurant. Please come home. We just want to hold our daughter again." I deleted the audio file before her fake manufactured tears could take up another kilobyte of my digital storage. It was a flawless masterclass in gaslighting. There was absolutely no mention of the Michelin star ambush. There was no apology for Melanie throwing a $5,000 wine bill at my face or calling me an uneducated dropout. There was certainly no acknowledgement of their vile attempt to blackmail my most valuable banking client. They were simply attempting to rewrite history on the fly, slapping a fresh coat of sentimental paint over 2 decades of targeted emotional and financial abuse. They did not want their daughter back. They wanted their corporate bank accounts unfrozen. The glass door to my office slid open and Desmond Vance strode in. Desmond was my lead corporate counsel, a ruthless, brilliant legal shark who viewed corporate acquisitions with the same cold, calculating precision a surgeon views a scalpel. He dropped a heavy leather binder onto my desk, his sharp eyes flicking toward the massive floral arrangement with a look of undisguised disgust. "I see the Barrett desperation campaign has officially launched," Desmond said, tapping the leather binder with a gold pen. "I just received 4 separate, highly frantic emails from your father's legal team begging for an emergency restructuring meeting. They are completely cornered, Cassidy. You hold 92% of their toxic commercial paper. They have missed 3 consecutive vendor payments, their supply chain is entirely halted, and they are leveraging the family estate just to keep the lights on." Desmond leaned over the desk, his expression dead serious. "My advice is simple and absolute. Ignore the ridiculous flowers. Ignore the sobbing, manipulative voicemails. You do not owe these people a healing dinner. You owe them a final eviction notice. Give me the authorization right now, and I will freeze their remaining personal trusts, seize the distribution warehouses, and liquidate the entire company by Monday morning. We can crush them without you ever having to look them in the eye again." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city logistics grid that my software controlled. Desmond was right from a purely legal and financial standpoint. It would be clinical. It would be clean. But clinical and clean did not account for the 20 years of being treated like a defective product. It did not account for the nights I went hungry while my parents bought Melanie another luxury vehicle. I did not just want to take their company through a sterile pile of paperwork. I wanted them to willingly hand it over, firmly believing they had manipulated me right up until the steel trap snapped shut on their wrists. I turned back to Desmond, feeling a cold, dark smile form on my lips. "Seizing the assets through legal filings from a distance is far too easy, Desmond. They have spent their entire lives treating me like I am naive, stupid, and desperate for their validation. I want to see exactly what they are willing to do to keep their country club memberships and their luxury cars. I want to watch them swallow their massive pride and beg for my mercy." I walked past the ridiculous $2,000 floral arrangement and headed straight for the private dressing room attached to my office. I pulled out a custom-tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. It was the kind of impeccable sharp armor designed specifically for high-stakes corporate warfare. I adjusted the lapels, checked my reflection in the full-length mirror, and saw exactly what I needed to see. I looked exactly like the ruthless billionaire they had unwittingly driven me to become. I stepped back into the main office, grabbing my car keys from the glass desk. "Prepare the hostile takeover documents, Desmond," I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. "Have them completely legally binding and ready for my signature tonight. I am going to this healing family dinner to see exactly how low they are willing to crawl." The iron gates of this Barrett estate swung open, welcoming my driver onto the pristine circular driveway. The sprawling stone mansion was illuminated by theatrical landscape lighting, a grand monument to generational wealth that was currently standing on the edge of a financial cliff. I stepped out of my car, my heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone. I clutched my sleek leather briefcase tightly. Inside lay the fully executed hostile takeover documents. Desmond had drafted a stack of paper that held the absolute power to erase the Barrett legacy from existence. My mother swung the heavy front doors open before I could even reach for the brass knocker. Patricia wore a flowing silk evening gown and a smile so wide and entirely artificial that it looked painful. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating embrace, enveloping me in a cloud of heavy floral perfume. "Cassidy, darling," Patricia cooed, pulling back to cup my face in her manicured hands. "We are just so incredibly thrilled you came home. Let us leave all that silly restaurant nonsense in the past where it belongs. Tonight is about healing. Tonight is about family." I stepped out of her grip, keeping my expression pleasantly neutral. I walked into the grand foyer, instantly noticing the subtle signs of their quiet desperation. Several expensive paintings were missing from the walls, likely pawned off to cover short-term margin calls. In the formal dining room, the crystal chandelier cast a glittering light over a meticulously set table. My father stood at the head of the table, projecting his usual aura of arrogant command, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. Melanie sat to his right, wearing a tight, uncomfortable smile. Beside her sat Jamal. My brother-in-law looked completely physically ill. He stared rigidly at the fine china plate in front of him, a thin sheen of cold sweat coating his forehead. He refused to make eye contact with me, terrified that I was about to drop his massive embezzlement confession right onto the dining table. "Please sit," my father commanded warmly, gesturing to the chair to his left. "Your mother has spent all afternoon in the kitchen preparing your absolute favorite meal to celebrate your return to the fold." Patricia proudly motioned for the hired staff to remove the silver cloches from our plates. Beneath them sat massive rare portions of beef, Wellington drizzled in a rich truffle reduction. I stared at the pastry-wrapped meat. It was an exquisite dish. It was also Melanie's absolute favorite meal. I had been a strict vegetarian since I was 15 years old, a fact my mother had completely forgotten or simply never bothered to remember. "It looks wonderful, Patricia," I said, reaching for my water glass instead of my fork. "You always did know exactly what Melanie liked." Melanie stiffened, her jaw ticking slightly, but Patricia completely ignored the verbal jab, waving her hand with a breathless laugh. Richard took the heavy crystal decanter and personally poured a generous measure of vintage Bordeaux into my glass. He settled back into his armchair, swirling the dark red liquid, adopting the paternal, benevolent tone he only used when he was about to rip someone apart in a boardroom. "We have to admit, Cassidy, we were thoroughly impressed by the revelations today," Richard began, offering a magnanimous nod. "Building a logistics platform of that magnitude requires a certain ruthless drive. It is the exact same drive I used to build Barrett Distribution. It proves you carry my blood in your veins. But running a tech startup is very different from managing a legacy corporation. You are swimming in very deep, very dangerous waters now." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs. "I am managing to keep my head above water, Richard." My father chuckled, a patronizing sound that echoed off the high ceiling. "For now, perhaps. But the market is volatile. You need experienced allies. You need the protection of an established name. That is why your mother and I have decided to bring you back into the family business. We are prepared to offer you an executive vice president position at Barrett Distribution. It is a massive leap for someone with your background, but we believe in second chances." I looked at him, letting the silence stretch. "And what exactly does this miraculous second chance cost me?" Richard leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, switching into his most persuasive negotiating posture. "The company is currently undergoing a minor strategic restructuring. We simply need a temporary bridge loan to smooth out some aggressive banking errors. In exchange for your shiny new VP title and a guaranteed seat at the family table, we just need you to inject $15 million of capital into our primary operating account by tomorrow morning." The sheer delusion of his pitch was staggering. He was not asking for a bailout. He was framing a desperate financial rescue as a prestigious career opportunity. He was offering me a fake title at a bankrupt company that I already legally owned, all for the low price of $15 million in liquid cash. Before I could dissect his ridiculous offer, Melanie leaned across the table. She reached out and patted my hand, her touch cold and entirely condescending. "It is the smartest move you could possibly make," Melanie said, her tone dripping with Ivy League superiority. "You stumbled into a massive pile of money, but you do not have the fundamental education to sustain it. Tech money disappears overnight. Real wealth requires sophisticated management. With my advanced finance degree, I can personally help manage these new funds for you. We will integrate your software into our distribution network, and I will handle the heavy lifting of the asset management. We both know you simply do not have the academic background to handle this level of global finance without making a fatal mistake. Jamal closed his eyes tightly, looking like a man waiting for a bomb to detonate. I looked down at Melanie's manicured hand resting on mine. I looked up at my father, who was watching me with hungry, predatory expectation. They were not attempting to heal our family. They were attempting to absorb my empire to plug the sinking holes in their own ship, all while keeping me firmly beneath their boots. A slow, genuinely terrifying smile spread across my face. It was the predator's smile they had meticulously trained me to wear. I gently pulled my hand out from under Melanie's grasp. I reached down to the floor, lifted my sleek leather briefcase, and placed it directly onto the center of the immaculate dining table. I unzipped the main compartment with a sharp metallic sound that sliced right through the tension in the room. "Let us talk about fatal mistakes, Melanie," I said, my voice completely stripped of any residual daughterly affection. "Let us talk about exactly who needs their assets managed." I watched the sudden flash of defensiveness cross my father's face. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals fight back with lawyers and injunctions. If I slammed my hostile takeover documents on the table with a declaration of war, Richard would stall the legal process for years. But his ego was his ultimate weakness. I instantly shifted my strategy. I erased the cold, predatory edge from my voice and allowed my shoulders to slump in manufactured defeat. I let out a long, trembling sigh and looked down at my hands, playing the exact role they had written for me. "You are right," I whispered, forcing a tone of overwhelming vulnerability. "I am entirely out of my depth." The sudden shift in the room was palpable. The defensive tension immediately evaporated, replaced by a suffocating wave of collective smugness. Melanie leaned back in her chair, shooting our mother a triumphant, knowing look. Patricia pressed a hand to her chest, letting out a dramatic gasp of relief. Richard practically vibrated with excitement, his predatory grin returning in full force. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Desmond had prepared. I kept my eyes lowered, playing the part of the terrified, uneducated girl who had stumbled into a fortune she could not comprehend. "The algorithms run themselves," I lied, my voice shaking slightly. "But the corporate finance side is terrifying. Vanguard is throwing enterprise contracts at me overseas, investors are demanding equity, and my legal team treats me like a child. I have all this capital, but I do not know how to build a legacy. I need the safety of the Barrett name. I need my family." Patricia actually wiped a fake tear from her eye. "Oh, Cassidy," my mother cooed, reaching across the table. "We are your family. We will always protect you from those corporate vultures." I slid the heavy stack of documents across the polished mahogany table, pushing them directly in front of my father. I looked up at him with wide, desperate eyes. "If you are truly willing to make me an executive vice president, I am ready to wire $15 million into the Barrett Distribution primary operating account tomorrow morning to clear the immediate debt," I said, making sure my voice sounded appropriately eager. My lawyer drafted this operating agreement to authorize the capital injection and outline my new position. He said it was just standard corporate boilerplate, but I wanted to bring it to you first. "I want to do this right, Dad." Richard stared at the documents like a starving man looking at a feast. The words $15 million echoed in his mind, completely blinding him to any potential threat. He did not see a hostile takeover. He saw a limitless piggy bank sitting right across his dining room table. He picked up the contract, his eyes skimming only the bolded numbers on the very first page. He saw the wire transfer authorization. He saw the sum of $15 million. He did not bother to turn to page 2. He did not read the buried clauses Desmond had meticulously crafted. He did not see the stipulations that instantly forfeited all of his executive voting rights upon the transfer of funds. He did not see the section that legally transferred the deed of the Barrett estate as collateral for the cash injection. He was entirely consumed by his own monumental greed. Standard boilerplate from a startup lawyer is practically worthless. Richard scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. You are incredibly lucky you brought this to me, Cassidy. These tech lawyers do not understand legacy logistics. But this will suffice for the immediate transfer. We can draft a proper, sophisticated equity contract once the funds clear tomorrow. Jamal, who was still sweating profusely, finally looked up. Mr. Barrett, perhaps we should have our legal department review the terms before you sign anything. Jamal suggested, his voice trembling with genuine fear. Richard slammed his fist on the table, silencing his son-in-law instantly. We do not have time for legal review, Jamal, my father barked. The banks open at 8 in the morning. I am not risking a total corporate default because of bureaucratic red tape. This is family business. My father reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He flipped to the final signature page of the contract and aggressively scribbled his name on the dotted line. He slid the document over to Jamal, forcing him to sign as the corporate witness. Jamal looked at me, his eyes pleading for mercy, but he took the pen and signed his name, officially executing the absolute destruction of Barrett Distribution. I reached across the table and gently pulled the signed documents back toward me. I squared the edges of the paper and slid the contract safely back into my leather briefcase. The metallic zip of the closure sounded incredibly final. Richard stood up from the head of the table, his chest puffed out with arrogant triumph. He snapped his fingers at the hired staff standing near the dining room entrance. Bring the Dom Perignon, Richard commanded, his voice booming with absolute victory. The waiter hurried over with a chilled bottle of vintage champagne and popped the cork with a loud, festive snap. He quickly filled their crystal flutes. Richard raised his glass high in the air, looking around the table at his wife and his golden child. He did not look at me. I was no longer a person to him. I was simply a cleared debt. To the future of Barrett Distribution, Richard proclaimed loudly, a massive, arrogant smile plastered across his face. And let this be a lesson to all the corporate vultures circling our gates. The Barrett men always win. Patricia and Melanie cheered, raising their glasses and taking long, celebratory sips of the expensive champagne. I stood up from my chair, lifting my briefcase by the polished leather handle. I looked around the room, burning the image of their oblivious celebration into my memory. I will initiate the wire transfer at dawn, I said, my voice returning to its smooth, lethal register. Enjoy the champagne, Richard. You are certainly going to need it. Patricia completely missed the glacial shift in the room's atmosphere. My mother was already mentally spending the $15 million I had just falsely promised. She clapped her hands together, her heavy diamond rings catching the dazzling light of the crystal chandelier overhead. "Oh, this is simply marvelous!" Patricia gushed, entirely oblivious to the predatory glint in my eye or the sudden tension rolling off her son-in-law. With this massive infusion of capital, we can finally upgrade to the platinum tier at the Oak Ridge Country Club. I was telling Susan just last week that our current membership is dreadfully restrictive, and Melanie, darling, we can immediately look into securing that summer house in Aspen you wanted for the ski season. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping sharply against the polished hardwood floor. I took my time methodically buttoning the center button of my charcoal Tom Ford blazer. I walked over to the antique credenza where the smart home control panel rested. With one hard press of my index finger, I killed the classical string quartet music piping through the dining room speakers. The sudden absolute silence in the cavernous room was deafening. It sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the air. "You misunderstand, Richard," I said, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. I did not call him Dad. That privilege had expired decades ago. That was not a bailout. That was not a bridge loan to save your country club memberships or buy Melanie a vacation home. Richard's celebratory grin faltered. He lowered his vintage champagne flute, his brow furrowing in a mixture of deep confusion and growing irritation. "What are you talking about, Cassidy? We just signed the operating agreement. You promised the $15 million. You gave us your word." "You signed a debt-to-equity conversion clause," I stated flatly, walking slowly back toward the dining table, letting each word land like a physical blow. Did you really think a tech billionaire uses standard single-page boilerplate contracts? Did you honestly believe I would blindly hand over $15 million in liquid cash for a meaningless vice president title in a logistics company that is actively bleeding to death? Richard scoffed, waving his hand as if he could physically swat my words away. Do not be ridiculous. You said it was a capital injection. Jamal witnessed the signature. Jamal, I said, snapping my gaze to my terrified brother-in-law. You are the chief financial officer of this sinking ship. Tell our former chief executive officer what happens when a company completely defaults on its primary commercial paper and the sole debt holder initiates a hostile conversion. Jamal looked like he was about to vomit directly onto his expensive beef Wellington. He gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table, his knuckles stark white sweat beading on his forehead. The debt holder can swap the outstanding debt for controlling equity. Jamal whispered, his voice cracking in absolute terror. They can absorb the voting shares to satisfy the financial deficit. Exactly. I smiled, though there was zero warmth in my expression. Over the past 48 hours, Vanguard Logistics AI bought up every single toxic loan, every missed vendor invoice, and every defaulted credit line Barrett Distribution possessed. You owed the international banks $50 million, Richard. As of this morning, you owed me $50 million. Richard's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He scrambled to snatch the carbon copy of the contract Jamal had left near the centerpieces. His eyes, previously blinded by sheer arrogance and unadulterated greed, darted frantically across the dense legal text. He finally turned to page 2. He saw the bolded text he had completely ignored because he assumed his uneducated daughter could not possibly draft a lethal corporate trap. He read the words irrevocable transfer of voting rights. He read immediate forfeiture of executive authority. He read asset liquidation protocols. You said this was a cash injection? Richard stammered, his hands shaking so violently the heavy paper rattled against the table. You said you were wiring $15 million tomorrow morning to clear the company debt. I am wiring $15 million to Vanguard's own holding accounts to officially acquire your remaining physical assets. I clarified my tone, razor sharp. It is not a loan to you. It is a direct purchase of the company's newly issued voting shares. The contract you just signed without reading specifically authorized a complete corporate restructuring. It executed the debt-to-equity swap flawlessly. Melanie jumped out of her chair, her face contorted with ugly, desperate rage. You cannot do this. We have a corporate legal team. We will tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years. You are a fraud, Cassidy. I let out a harsh, barking laugh that cut right through her Ivy League entitlement. You have lawyers who have not been paid their retainer fees in 3 months, Melanie. And you just watched your father willingly sign away the entire company while drinking vintage champagne and bragging about winning. There is no court battle. There is only the harsh reality of your own monumental arrogance. You handed me the keys because you were too arrogant to read the lock. Patricia was clutching her pearl necklace, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The reality of losing her country club, her mansion, and her social status was finally short-circuiting her brain. Richard was hyperventilating now. He dropped the contract as if the paper had physically burned his fingers. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the purest form of absolute terror I had ever witnessed. The great Richard Barrett was completely broken. I leaned across the dining table, placing both hands flat on the polished wood, bringing my face mere inches from his. I wanted him to see the cold, calculated destruction in my eyes. I wanted him to know exactly who had bested him. You did not just accept a loan, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. You just sold me 85% of Barrett Distribution for pennies on the dollar. I am the majority shareholder. I paused, letting the devastating reality crush the very last breath out of his lungs. I am your boss. The heavy industrial glass doors of Barrett Distribution's lobby hissed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a guillotine blade in the cavernous, silent space. It was 8 a.m. on the dot. I walked with the deliberate, measured stride of a woman who didn't just own the building, but the very dirt it was constructed on. My security detail, two towering suit-clad men I had poached from a top-tier private firm in Chicago, trailed exactly 2 steps behind me. Their presence served as a physical boundary between my past life and my new reality. I reached the executive elevator bank to find Richard standing there, his face a mottled, terrified red. He had clearly been pulling strings all night, frantically calling in favors from secondary banks and former board members who now owed him absolutely nothing. Behind him, a small, disorganized squad of internal security guards stood with their arms folded, looking deeply uncomfortable. Richard stepped forward, his eyes wild, his tie crooked. "You cannot be here, Cassidy," he barked, his voice cracking with the remnants of his shattered authority. "I have declared this floor a restricted operational zone. My security team has orders to remove any unauthorized personnel. I have already contacted the municipal police department to report a hostile intrusion. You are making a massive illegal mistake that will land you in a federal holding cell." I didn't stop walking. I didn't even slow down to acknowledge his pathetic attempt at posturing. I looked directly at the head of his internal security detail. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting perfectly into the high-ceilinged lobby. "My name is Cassidy Barrett. I am the majority shareholder of Barrett Distribution. My firm Vanguard Logistics AI has officially acquired the controlling debt and voting equity of this entire corporation as of this morning. Look at your mobile devices. Every single one of you should have received an automated personnel update 5 minutes ago. Your employment contracts are now bound to Vanguard. If you continue to follow the orders of a man who no longer has the authority to issue them, you are in breach of contract and will be terminated immediately. Do you understand?" The security guards exchanged glances, their bravado evaporating in seconds as their phones chimed in unison. They weren't soldiers loyal to a dying king. They were employees who wanted to keep their health insurance and pensions. One by one, they stepped aside the path to the elevator clearing, as if I were parting the Red Sea. Richard stood there, mouth agape, watching his last line of defense crumble without firing a single shot. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on my father's trembling silhouette. I reached the top floor and marched straight into the boardroom. The air was stale, smelling of decades of expensive leather and desperate men. The board table, a massive monolithic slab of polished granite, was already crowded. The remaining executives sat in a state of catatonic shock. Melanie was already standing at the opposite end of the room, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill register. "This is a coup!" she shrieked, slamming her palms onto the table. "It is illegal. We did not agree to any acquisition terms. Cassidy, you are a parasite. You are stealing the life's work of your own father because you are too small-minded to build anything of your own." I ignored her completely. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the heavy, high-backed leather throne that Richard had occupied since I was a toddler, and sat down. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp click of my laptop opening. I tapped a few keys, and the massive projection screen at the front of the room flickered to life. It didn't show revenue charts. It displayed a detailed, itemized flow of funds from the primary operating account into an offshore entity that had been active for exactly 6 months. I looked slowly around the table, meeting the terrified gaze of every single executive who had looked the other way while my father and sister looted the company to fund their pathetic, shallow lifestyles. "Sit down, Melanie," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "Right now, I am finished listening to your hysterical, uneducated screeching. I want to talk to your husband," Jamal, I said, turning my gaze to the far end of the table. The CFO was sweating profusely, his expensive silk shirt clinging to his back. His eyes were darting toward the exit, his breathing fast and shallow. "Jamal, look at the screen," I commanded. "Let us discuss the $2.5 million missing from the Q3 ledgers. You seem to have made a fascinating accounting error. You categorized it as miscellaneous vendor overhead, yet the wire transfer originated from a shell company in the Cayman Islands that just happens to be registered under your mother's maiden name. I have the bank statements, the routing numbers, and a digital trail that even a first-year accounting intern could follow to your front door." The room erupted into panicked whispers. Jamal's chair scraped loudly as he tried to stand, his legs clearly failing him. "It is not what it looks like, Cassidy." Jamal stammered, his voice a pathetic whimper. Richard told me to do it. He said it was just a temporary fix to cover the margin calls. I was just following orders. I folded my hands on the table, leaning forward into the light of the projection screen. Following orders is not a legal defense for massive corporate embezzlement, Jamal. You had a fiduciary responsibility to this company, to the shareholders, and to the law. You chose to be a complicit thief for a family that would throw you to the wolves the second the police sirens started wailing. And make no mistake, the police are currently parked in the lobby. I hit a key and a document appeared on the screen, a formal confession of financial malfeasance, ready for a signature. You have two choices, Jamal. You can sign this confession, implicate Richard in every single instance of fraudulent reporting for the past 5 years, and perhaps, just perhaps, I might convince the district attorney to consider a plea deal for you. Or you can continue to protect the Barretts, in which case you will be the first person let out of this building in handcuffs while I turn over every piece of evidence I have to the federal authorities within the hour. Melanie stood frozen, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fear. She looked at her father, then at her husband, then at me. Finally realizing that the world she had built, a world of unearned privilege and constant effortless manipulation, was currently being systematically dismantled. The silence that followed was heavy, stifling, and absolute. The power in the room had shifted not just legally, but fundamentally. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey, and they had just realized exactly how far I was willing to go to ensure they never harmed another person again. I watched Jamal's pen hover over the paper, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold it, while my father stood in the corner, a broken man watching his legacy turn to ash. The trap was not just snapped shut, it was welded into place. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Vance, leaving my father entirely alone in the suffocating silence of his corner office. The flashing red error messages on his computer monitors no longer looked like simple technical glitches. They looked like a countdown to his absolute ruin. Richard Barrett was a man who had spent his entire life stepping on the throats of others to keep his head above water, and now the crushing weight of his own hubris was dragging him down to the bottom of the ocean. He stared at the redacted banking document left on his desk. The reality was undeniable. His discarded, uneducated daughter was the supreme architect of his destruction. Panic is a powerful motivator. It strips away pride and replaces it with base survival instinct. Richard did not see a daughter he had abused and abandoned. He saw a lifeline. He saw a billionaire who shared his last name. His mind frantically spun a new narrative. He would play the role of the proud, tough, loving patriarch. He grabbed his desk phone, barking frantic orders to his terrified assistant, setting his pathetic strategy into motion. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass of my penthouse office at Vanguard Logistics. I stood at my desk reviewing the global shipping algorithms that were actively rendering Barrett distribution obsolete. The panoramic view of the city skyline was a daily reminder of the empire I had built from nothing. My executive assistant Elena walked into the room pushing a heavy silver utility cart. Her expression was caught somewhere between profound shock and sheer amusement. Resting on the cart was an absolutely massive, completely obscene floral arrangement. It was a towering monstrosity of rare white orchids, imported lilies, and exotic blue hydrangeas. It looked less like a gift and more like a floral tribute meant for a state funeral. "These just cleared the ground floor security screening," Madam CEO Elena said, handing me a thick gold embossed envelope. "The courier required a specialized freight elevator just to bring them up here." He proudly mentioned the arrangement cost $2,000. I took the envelope, slicing it open with a sleek titanium letter opener. The handwriting inside was undeniably my father's, but the tone was entirely alien. The card read with sickening manufactured sweetness, "To my brilliant daughter, I am so incredibly proud of the massive empire you have built. We have let far too much time pass between us. Let us bridge this gap and unite our strengths. Love always, Dad." I tossed the expensive card directly into the wastebasket beneath my desk. The sheer desperation practically radiated from the thick cardstock. My father was bleeding cash, his company was hours away from a catastrophic default, and he had somehow scraped together $2,000 just to send a physical manifestation of his panic. Before I could instruct Elena to have the flowers thrown into the industrial incinerator, my private secure cell phone began to vibrate violently against the glass surface of my desk. It was a highly encrypted number I had changed multiple times a line, heavily guarded by my corporate security division. The caller identification flashed my mother's name. Richard had clearly deployed his shady private investigator to bypass my security firewalls just to acquire my direct contact information. I let the call go to voicemail, watching the screen glow until the ringing finally stopped. 2 minutes later, an audio notification popped up. I tapped the screen and put the message on speaker, letting the sound fill the immaculate office. Patricia Barrett's voice echoed through the room, thick with theatrical, breathless sobs. Cassidy, my sweet, beautiful girl. Oh, I have just been weeping all morning. Your father and I were so completely blind to your absolute genius. We made mistakes, terrible parenting mistakes, but we were just trying to prepare you for the harsh realities of the business world. We thought pushing you away would make you a strong, independent woman, but we never meant to cause you pain. Please, sweetheart, you must know that family is everything. Blood is thicker than any temporary misunderstanding. We are hosting a private healing family dinner tonight at the estate. Just us. We just want to hold our daughter again. I deleted the audio file before her fake manufactured tears could take up another kilobyte of my digital storage. It was a flawless masterclass in desperate gaslighting. There was absolutely no mention of their vile treatment of me over the last decade. There was no apology for cutting off my tuition and throwing me onto the street. There was certainly no acknowledgement of their recent attempt to blackmail a wealthy man they hallucinated was funding my lifestyle. They were simply attempting to rewrite history on the fly, slapping a fresh coat of sentimental paint over 2 decades of targeted emotional and financial abuse. They did not want their daughter back. They wanted their corporate bank accounts unfrozen. The glass doors to my office slid silently open and Desmond strode into the room. Desmond was my lead corporate counsel, a ruthless, brilliant legal shark who viewed corporate acquisitions with the same cold, calculating precision a surgeon views a scalpel. He dropped a heavy leather binder onto my desk, his sharp eyes flicking toward the massive floral arrangement with a look of undisguised disgust. I see the Barrett desperation campaign has officially launched, Desmond said, tapping the leather binder with a gold pen. I just received 4 separate, highly frantic emails from your father's legal team begging for an emergency restructuring meeting. They are completely cornered, Cassidy. You hold all of their toxic commercial paper. They have missed 3 consecutive vendor payments, their supply chain is entirely halted, and they are leveraging the family estate just to keep the lights on. Desmond leaned over the desk, his expression dead serious. My advice is simple and absolute. Ignore the ridiculous flowers. Ignore the sobbing, manipulative voicemails. Do not engage with these people. You do not owe them a healing dinner or a single second of your time. Give me the authorization right now, and I will freeze their remaining personal trusts, seize the distribution warehouses, and liquidate the entire company by Monday morning. We can legally crush them without you ever having to look them in the eye again. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city logistics grid that my software controlled. Desmond was absolutely right from a purely legal and financial standpoint. It would be clinical, it would be clean. But clinical and clean did not account for the 20 years of being treated like a defective product. It did not account for the nights I went hungry while they lived in absolute luxury. I did not just want to take their company through a sterile pile of paperwork filed from a distance. I wanted them to willingly hand it over, firmly believing they had manipulated me right up until the steel trap snapped shut on their wrists. I wanted them to expose their true, unadulterated greed. I turned back to Desmond, feeling a cold, dark smile form on my lips. Seizing the assets through legal filings from a distance is far too easy, Desmond. They have spent their entire lives treating me like I am naive, stupid, and desperate for their validation. I want to see exactly what they are willing to do to keep their country club memberships and their luxury cars. I walked past the ridiculous floral arrangement and headed straight for the private dressing room attached to my executive suite. I pulled out a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. It was the kind of impeccable, sharp armor designed specifically for high-stakes corporate warfare. I adjusted the lapels, checking my reflection in the full-length mirror. I looked exactly like the ruthless force they had unwittingly driven me to become. I stepped back into the main office, grabbing my car keys from the glass desk. "Prepare the hostile takeover documents," Desmond Ray instructed, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. "I am going to dinner to see exactly how low they are willing to crawl." The sharp, stinging crack of Melanie's hand striking Jamal's cheek echoed like a gunshot in the silent boardroom. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, the bitter taste perfectly matching the cold, clinical atmosphere in the room. I watched over the rim of my porcelain cup as the golden couple violently turned on each other. Jamal stumbled backward, clutching his rapidly reddening face, his eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and pure terror. He looked at his wife, expecting solidarity, expecting the fierce defense she had just mounted moments ago. Instead, he found only the vicious, cornered fury of a woman watching her platinum credit cards evaporate into thin air. Melanie lunged at him again, her manicured nails curled into claws, screaming that he had ruined her life, that he was a thief and a pathetic failure. She did not care about the corporate embezzlement. She only cared that he got caught and cost her the family fortune. I lowered my coffee cup to the polished granite table with a soft final clink. I raised 2 fingers, signaling the massive security contractors standing by the heavy wooden doors. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. One guard seized Jamal by his tailored shoulder, effortlessly spinning him around, while the other firmly secured his wrists behind his back. Jamal thrashed and kicked his expensive Italian loafers, scuffing the hardwood floor. He pleaded with Richard to do something, begging the frozen board members to intervene and save him. Not a single person moved. They all stared at the table, absolutely petrified that making eye contact with me would result in their own immediate termination. "Get him out of my building!" I ordered, my voice cutting cleanly through Jamal's frantic, humiliating sobbing. "Make sure he leaves his corporate access badge, his company phone, and the keys to the executive company car at the front security desk. If he sets one foot on Barrett Distribution property ever again, I want him arrested and charged with criminal trespassing." The heavy oak doors slammed shut instantly, cutting off Jamal's pathetic cries. The sudden quiet returning to the room was suffocating. Melanie crumpled into a heap in the corner of the boardroom, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, dramatic sobs. Her entire identity, built entirely on unearned superiority and stolen wealth, was completely demolished. She was no longer the untouchable, perfect heiress. She was the wife of a disgraced, unemployed felon, heading straight for a federal indictment. Richard watched his son-in-law get dragged away like a common criminal. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the absolute destruction of his inner circle. The predatory corporate shark persona he had worn like armor for decades was entirely gone. It was replaced by the desperate, flailing panic of a drowning man realizing there was no rescue boat coming. He looked at the remaining executives, desperately searching their faces for a lifeline, a shred of loyalty, but they had all mentally surrendered. I owned the debt. I owned the building. I owned his legacy. Richard turned back to me, his face glistening with a sheen of cold sweat. The arrogant aggression vanished from his posture. He slumped forward, gripping the edge of the granite table, resorting to the absolute last weapon in his pathetic arsenal: emotional manipulation. "Cassidy, please!" Richard begged, his voice trembling with manufactured agony and fake remorse. "You cannot do this. You are tearing our family apart. I am your father. I gave you life. You owe us. We clothed you, we sheltered you, we raised you to be the brilliant, formidable woman sitting in that chair right now. Everything you are is because of the foundation we provided. You cannot just destroy your own flesh and blood over some corporate dispute. Family is sacred. We can fix this together. We can be a family again." I stared at him, my expression entirely carved from ice. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the lingering guilt of a daughter seeking validation. I felt nothing but absolute crystalline clarity. You did not raise a brilliant woman, Richard, I countered smoothly. You raised a scapegoat. You raised a convenient punching bag for Melanie. You raised a financial liability that you discarded the very second I became inconvenient to your lavish lifestyle. Do not dare invoke the sanctity of family when you have treated me like a disposable tax write-off for 20 years. You are not my father. You are just a man who made a terrible business decision. Suddenly, a loud gasping wheeze shattered the tension in the room. Patricia clutched her chest, her face contorting into a mask of pure agony. She slumped heavily against her high-backed leather chair, one hand gripping her throat, the other reaching out blindly toward Richard. I cannot breathe, Patricia gasped, her voice reedy and desperately weak. Richard, my heart, the pain, it is too much. Call for help. Richard rushed to her side, playing the role of the terrified, devoted husband flawlessly. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with projected horror. Look what you are doing to her. Are you happy now? You are giving your own mother a heart attack? Someone call an ambulance right now. Two of the terrified board members immediately reached into their pockets for their cell phones. I slammed my hand down flat on the table, the sharp, violent crack freezing everyone in the room. Put your phones away, I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or debate. No one is calling an emergency unit. Cassidy, she is dying, Richard screamed, holding his wife's hand. She is acting, I corrected, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. I spent my entire childhood watching her fake migraines, panic attacks, and mysterious fainting spells every single time she was held accountable for her actions. She did this when she crashed her Mercedes into the country club gates. She did this when the IRS audited her offshore boutique. She is doing it right now because she thinks it will force me to pause the hostile takeover out of basic human sympathy. I turned my piercing gaze directly to my mother. Drop the act, Patricia. It is pathetic, and it is deeply insulting to my intelligence. If you do not sit up straight and stop hyperventilating within the next 3 seconds, I will instruct my security team to drag you out of this building by your designer heels. Patricia's desperate wheezing stopped instantly. She blinked, lowering her hand from her chest, her face flushing with a deep, humiliated red. She sat up perfectly straight, smoothing the front of her pristine silk blouse, glaring at me with a venomous, unmasked hatred that confirmed exactly what I already knew. Her heart was perfectly fine. It was just entirely black. I turned my attention back to Richard, who was still hovering over her, his emotional leverage completely and utterly dismantled. He slowly stood up, backing away from his wife, realizing that every single trick, every lie, and every emotional manipulation had failed. Now that the theatrics have concluded, I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the cool stone table, I want to talk about 13 years ago. I want the real truth about why I was forced out of college, thrown out of my dorm room, and left completely destitute on the street. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door, looking for an escape that did not exist. We have been over this, Cassidy. The company was struggling. The real estate market crashed. We lost a massive distribution contract in Europe. It was a hard time for the economy. We simply did not have the liquid capital to pay your tuition anymore. It was a terrible, agonizing decision, but we had to protect the core business to ensure we all survived. You expect me to believe that a minor economic downturn forced you to cut off your youngest daughter, while Melanie was simultaneously handed a massive trust fund and a brand new luxury car for her graduation present? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. I told you it was complicated, Richard insisted, sweat dripping down his temples. Financial allocations were locked into specific trusts. We tried to find a way to keep you in school, we truly did. I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a crisp, single sheet of printed paper. I slid it slowly across the polished granite table, letting it come to a complete stop directly in front of Richard's trembling hands. My tech team spent the last 72 hours ripping through this company's obsolete servers, I said, watching the blood drain from his face. They recovered thousands of deleted files. This particular email was sent by you to Patricia 13 years ago, exactly 2 days before my tuition check bounced. Richard stared at the crisp white paper as if it were coated in a lethal flesh-eating poison. The arrogant flush of color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His hands, previously gripping the edge of the granite table in defiance, now shook so violently the paper rattled against the polished stone. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some slick corporate excuse, but his throat seized. He knew exactly what that document was, and he knew exactly what it proved. I did not give him the courtesy of silence. I did not let him quietly fold the paper and sweep his catastrophic sins under the rug. I stepped forward, reached over the massive table, and plucked the email directly from his trembling fingers. I held it up, making sure every single person in the room could see the official company letterhead and the digital timestamp. Since your memory is failing you so spectacularly, Richard, I will gladly refresh it for the room, I said, my voice projecting with icy, undeniable clarity. This is an internal email chain from May 14th, 13 years ago. The sender is Patricia Barrett. The recipient is Richard Barrett. The subject line reads, "College Funding Adjustments." I cleared my throat, making deliberate eye contact with the remaining board members, watching their expressions shift from fear to morbid curiosity. "Cassie's test scores are higher than Melanie's," I read, letting Patricia's shallow, venomous words echo off the high-vaulted ceilings of the boardroom. "If she goes to that school, Melanie will look incredibly bad by comparison. We cannot have the youngest outshining our heir. Drain Cassie's college fund and reroute the capital to pay for Melanie's wedding. Just tell Cassie the business is failing, and we need the liquidity to survive. She is gullible, she will believe it." I lowered the paper slowly. I looked directly at my mother. Patricia was entirely frozen, her perfectly manicured hands clamped tightly over her mouth. The fake dramatic panic attack she had staged just moments ago was completely gone. It was replaced by the very real, suffocating terror of absolute public exposure. She shrank back into her high-backed leather chair, looking smaller, older, and infinitely more pathetic than I had ever seen her. The mask of the sophisticated, loving matriarch had been violently ripped away, revealing the petty, jealous monster underneath. The reaction from the remaining executives was immediate and palpable. These were hardened, cutthroat corporate sharks who laid off thousands of workers and liquidated struggling startups before breakfast. But there is a distinct, unbridgeable difference between ruthless business tactics and the grotesque, premeditated destruction of your own child simply to massage an older sibling's ego. A collective murmur of absolute disgust rippled down the length of the granite table. The chief operations officer, a man who had worked alongside Richard for over 2 decades, literally pushed his chair away from my father, the legs screeching against the floor, creating a physical barrier of pure revulsion. They were looking at my parents not as leaders, but as repulsive liabilities. "You did not cut me off because the economy crashed," I stated, stepping away from the table and slowly pacing the length of the room, my heels clicking sharply like a metronome, ticking down their final seconds. "You did not sacrifice my education to save this company from ruin. You threw me onto the street with absolutely nothing because you were terrified I would shatter the fragile illusion of Melanie's superiority. You knowingly stole my tuition money to buy ice sculptures and imported caviar for a wedding to a man who just embezzled millions of dollars from this very firm." Melanie, still slumped in the corner after physically assaulting Jamal, let out a wretched, humiliated sob. Her entire existence was built on the belief that she was the golden child because of her own exceptional merit. Hearing that her parents had to actively sabotage my life, steal my future, and lie to my face just to make her look minimally competent completely shattered her narcissistic reality. She was not special. She was just an expensive manufactured lie. Richard slammed both of his heavy fists onto the granite table, the sudden violent noise making Patricia jump out of her seat. He was a cornered, wounded animal stripped of his wealth, his dignity, and the false narrative he had built his entire identity around. The boardroom was no longer his kingdom. The executives were staring at him like he was a diseased rat. "You ungrateful little brat!" Richard roared, spit flying from his lips as his face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. I am Richard Barrett. I built this empire with my own 2 hands. I gave you my name. You think you can waltz in here with your tech money and humiliate me in my own boardroom. You think you have won because you bought out some toxic debt. He was unraveling completely. The polished, untouchable CEO was gone, replaced by a desperate, flailing man lashing out blindly at the architect of his demise. He realized he could not save the company, so he clung desperately to the last remaining symbol of his status. "Get out of my building!" Richard screamed, pointing a trembling accusatory finger toward the heavy oak doors. "Take your security team and your offshore accounts and get the hell out of my sight. You might have stolen my company, Cassidy, but you have not destroyed me. I still have my personal wealth. I still have my private assets. At least I still have my mansion. You can take this failing distribution center, but you cannot touch my home." I stopped pacing. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, absorbing the sheer spectacular delusion of his outburst. A soft, genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest. It was a quiet, melodic sound, but in the dead, suffocating silence of the boardroom, it cut like a freshly sharpened razor blade. I slowly reached back into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a second document, this one bearing the unmistakable heavy gold seal of the county records office. "About your house, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper. "About your house, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper. I reached across the expanse of the polished granite and pulled the thick, heavy leather legal binder Desmond had prepared directly toward me. The sound of the leather dragging against the stone was like a blade being sharpened. I flipped it open, the crisp pages rustling loudly in the stagnant air of the boardroom. The executives, previously recoiling from my parents in disgust, now leaned forward. Their predatory instincts were fully awakened by the scent of fresh blood in the water. Richard stared at the open binder, his eyes darting frantically. He licked his dry lips, trying to summon a shred of the booming, commanding patriarch who had screamed at me just seconds ago. "You have no jurisdiction over my personal property," he stammered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "The estate is shielded. It is completely insulated from Barrett distribution. I set it up that way specifically to protect my family from corporate vultures like you." I slowly traced my manicured finger down the first column of numbers on the top document. "You did set it up that way," I agreed softly. "It was a remarkably clever legal structure designed to separate your corporate liabilities from your personal luxury. It would have worked flawlessly if you had not completely panicked 24 months ago." I looked up, meeting the horrified gaze of the chief financial officer, sitting 2 seats away from Richard. The CFO suddenly looked completely sick, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale green. "Did you know I addressed the board directly, projecting my voice so every syllable landed with maximum impact, that Barrett Distribution has been operating at a catastrophic net loss for 8 consecutive quarters?" Murmurs of absolute shock erupted around the table. The executives began talking over one another, demanding answers, staring at Richard with pure murderous intent. They had been lied to. Their stock options, their massive end-of-year bonuses, their very livelihoods had been propped up by a massive fabricated illusion. Silence. I commanded, striking the table once with the flat of my hand. The room fell instantly quiet again. I turned my attention back to my father, watching him sweat under the crushing weight of his exposed sins. "You hid the failing numbers from your own board, Richard. You falsified the quarterly projections to keep the stock price from plummeting into oblivion. But fake numbers do not pay vendors, and they certainly do not cover the massive gaping hole in your global supply chain. You needed fast, untraceable liquidity to cover the bleeding." I turned the page in the binder. The heavy parchment sounded like a judge's gavel falling. "No reputable bank would touch you." I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "Your credit lines were entirely maxed out. Your corporate assets were already leveraged to the absolute hilt. So you went to a secondary high-risk private equity lender. You needed $30 million in cash just to keep the lights on and the illusion alive. And to secure that kind of high-risk capital, you had to offer up the only truly unencumbered, highly valuable asset you had left. Patricia let out a sharp, genuine gasp. Her hands flew to her face, her eyes wide with a sudden horrifying realization. She slowly turned to look at her husband, her expression twisting from shock into absolute venomous betrayal. "Richard," she whispered, her voice shaking with raw, unadulterated terror. "What did you do? What did you sign?" "He signed away the kingdom." Patricia the First answered for him, not breaking eye contact with my father. "He secretly used the family mansion, the ancestral Barrett estate, the physical manifestation of your entire social standing, as the sole collateral to cover up his failing corporate numbers over the past 2 years." The boardroom descended into absolute chaos. Patricia began shrieking, pounding her fists against Richard's tailored shoulder, calling him a fool, a liar, and a traitor. She did not care about the business collapsing. The mansion was her entire identity. It was where she hosted her elite charity galas, where she flaunted her stolen wealth, where she looked down on the rest of the world. Melanie, hearing that her beloved childhood home was wrapped up in the scandal, wailed even louder from her pathetic heap on the floor. Richard grabbed Patricia's wrist, desperately trying to restrain her while shouting over the din. "I had no choice," he bellowed, his face purple with rage and panic. "I had to save the company. I was going to pay it back." The new European contract was supposed to clear the debt entirely. It was just a temporary bridge loan. I watched them tear each other apart for a long, deeply satisfying moment. This was the true face of the Barrett family. The second their money was threatened, they devoured each other. I closed the leather binder with a definitive heavy thud. "But you did not pay it back," I stated, my voice cutting through their screaming match like a knife. "You defaulted on the bridge loan last month. The private equity firm was preparing to seize the asset." Richard tore his eyes away from his hysterical wife and looked at me, a glimmer of desperate, pathetic defiance sparking in his chest. "So what?" he sneered, straightening his ruined tie with shaking hands. "So a private equity firm takes the house. We have offshore accounts. We can buy another estate. You still cannot touch my home, Cassidy. You only bought the commercial paper. You have no legal claim to my private residence." I offered him a smile so cold it could have frozen the blood in his veins. "You really have not been paying attention to how I do business, Richard. I did not just buy your commercial paper. Vanguard Logistics does not do things by halves. When I discovered how deeply you had buried yourself, I traced the high-risk loan right back to its source." I stood up from my chair, lifting a single thick envelope from the very back of the binder. "I bought the private equity firm that held your debt," I explained, watching his knees literally buckle beneath the table. "I absorbed their entire portfolio. When I bought the company's debt, I bought the collateral attached to it. The mansion isn't yours. It belongs to my corporation." Richard's jaw dropped. No sound came out. The absolute magnitude of his defeat finally crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. He was entirely ruined. He had no company. He had no legacy. He had no home. I walked slowly around the edge of the long granite table. The executives pulled their chairs in, desperately trying to get out of my way, treating me with the terrified reverence reserved for an apex predator. I stopped right next to Richard's chair. I looked down at the man who had tormented me, starved me of affection, and thrown me onto the street just to protect his fragile preferred daughter. I held the thick envelope out and let it fall. I dropped the foreclosure notice directly onto Richard's lap. He stared down at the bright red legal stamping as if it were a bomb about to detonate. "You have 72 hours to pack your things and vacate the premises. My demolition crew is scheduled for Monday." Richard did not say another word. He practically ripped the red-stamped notice from his lap, grabbed Melanie by her trembling arm, and dragged her out of the boardroom. They stumbled through the pristine glass hallways of Vanguard Logistics, surrounded by my security personnel, who ensured they left the building with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The elevator ride down to the lobby was suffocatingly silent, broken only by Melanie's continuous jagged weeping. Richard's mind was a frantic, chaotic blur of denial. He refused to accept that a daughter he had casually discarded could orchestrate his absolute ruin. He needed an aggressive counter-offensive. He needed the best legal mercenaries money could buy. Within the hour, Richard and Melanie were sitting in the immaculate mahogany-paneled office of Arthur Harrison. Arthur was the senior founding partner of Harrison Cole and Sterling, the most ruthless, egregiously expensive corporate litigation firm in the state. He was a man who specialized in pulling billionaires out of federal indictments and crushing hostile takeovers before breakfast. Richard slammed the crumpled copies of the foreclosure notice and the debt transfer agreements onto Arthur's massive glass desk, his hands shaking with manic energy. "File an emergency injunction immediately!" Richard barked, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Freeze all of Vanguard Logistics' assets. Tie her up in discovery for the next decade. She manipulated a private equity transfer to steal my family estate. I want cease and desist orders filed against her demolition crews right now." Arthur Harrison did not react to the screaming. He calmly adjusted his silver-framed glasses and pulled the documents toward him. For 20 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the sprawling corner office was the sharp rustle of thick paper and Melanie's pathetic continuous sniffling from the leather sofa. Richard paced the length of the room, practically vibrating with toxic adrenaline, waiting for the brilliant lawyer to find the loophole, the fatal flaw in my strategy. Finally, Arthur neatly restacked the papers, aligned the edges perfectly, and slid the file back across the glass desk. He took off his glasses and looked at Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional pity. "I cannot file an injunction, Richard." Arthur stated, his voice flat and clinical. "I cannot file a cease and desist. In fact, I strongly advise you to stop shouting and start listening, because your situation is infinitely worse than losing your house." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, slamming his hands down on the desk. "You are the best litigator in the city. Find a loophole." "There are no loopholes," Arthur replied coldly. "Cassidy's corporate counsel is brilliant. These contracts are entirely bulletproof. When you signed that bridge loan with the private equity firm, you explicitly waived your right to a prolonged foreclosure process in exchange for immediate unverified cash. You legally tethered your personal estate directly to your corporate debt. When Vanguard Logistics absorbed that private equity firm, they legally absorbed your collateral. The house belongs to your daughter's corporation. The demolition order is completely legal. If you try to stay past the 72-hour window, local law enforcement will physically remove you for trespassing on private commercial property." Melanie let out a piercing shriek, burying her face in a decorative silk pillow. "But that is just the beginning of your nightmare." Arthur continued, cutting off Richard's incoming protest. "I reviewed the financial summaries attached to the debt transfer. Jamal did not just mismanage your accounts. He orchestrated a massive, systematic embezzlement scheme right under your nose. He siphoned millions of dollars into offshore accounts to fund your daughter's lavish lifestyle." "That is Jamal's fault," Richard yelled, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "Let the police arrest him. I had nothing to do with that theft." Arthur leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into cold, unforgiving slits. "You are the chief executive officer, Richard. You personally signed the quarterly financial projections. You explicitly authorized the fraudulent revenue reports used to secure the bridge loan that put your house in jeopardy. You used falsified corporate data to acquire $30 million in private equity. That is not a simple accounting error. That is federal wire fraud." The remaining blood completely drained from Richard's face. He staggered backward, collapsing heavily into a leather guest chair. "Because you failed to exercise basic fiduciary duty, and because you signed off on Jamal's fabricated numbers, you are facing severe criminal liability for financial negligence," Arthur explained ruthlessly. "The Securities and Exchange Commission is already reviewing the Vanguard acquisition filings. The federal authorities will be knocking on your door by the end of the week. You are not just looking at bankruptcy, Richard. You are looking at a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I will pay you double your retainer." Richard begged, all of his arrogant bluster entirely evaporating. "I will pay you whatever you want. Just keep me out of prison." Arthur stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a final dismissive gesture. "You cannot pay my retainer, Richard. Your corporate accounts are seized. Your personal trusts are frozen by the acquisition terms. You have absolutely zero liquid capital. I do not work for free, and I certainly do not represent clients who are mathematically guaranteed to end up in federal custody. I suggest you go home and start packing." Richard and Melanie were practically thrown out of the law firm. The drive back to the estate was a suffocating nightmare of silence and terror. When they finally pushed through the massive custom wrought iron doors of the mansion, the echoing foyer felt less like a palace and more like a massive decorated tomb. Patricia was pacing the imported Italian marble floor, still wearing the wrinkled silk blouse from the boardroom, a half-empty glass of expensive vodka clutched in her trembling hand. She stopped pacing the second she saw their faces. The hollow, defeated look in Richard's eyes confirmed her absolute worst fears. "Tell me Harrison found a way to stop her," Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "Tell me we are keeping the house." Richard slowly shook his head, looking completely hollowed out. "We are keeping nothing, Patricia. Harrison laughed us out of the room. The contracts are completely ironclad. The house is gone on Monday. All of our accounts are frozen, and Jamal's embezzlement has triggered a federal investigation. The SEC is coming for me. I am going to prison." Melanie collapsed onto the grand staircase, sobbing hysterically about her ruined reputation, her frozen credit cards, and her impending homelessness. She curled into a pathetic ball, completely useless in the face of actual adversity. Patricia stared at the crystal chandelier hanging above them, the glittering prisms mocking their sudden spectacular downfall. She looked at her broken husband and her weeping, helpless daughter. The reality of their situation crashed down upon her with crushing, undeniable weight. The country club memberships were void. The luxury cars would be repossessed. The elite social circle they had sacrificed me to maintain would shun them the second the indictments went public. They had absolutely zero leverage, zero money, and zero allies. Patricia slowly lowered her vodka glass. Her eyes, usually filled with arrogant superiority, hardened into a cold, desperate calculation. The maternal warmth she had faked for decades was entirely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. She realized there was no legal loophole. There was no secret bank account to save them. There was only one person on the entire planet who possessed the financial power to pay off the debt, halt the demolition, and potentially shield Richard from the federal investigators. "Stop crying!" Patricia snapped, her voice cracking like a whip across the echoing foyer. She walked over to Richard, grabbing his arms and forcing him to look her directly in the eyes. "We are not going to a homeless shelter, and you are not going to federal prison," Patricia declared, her tone practically vibrating with desperate, humiliating resolve. "We have exactly one option left. We have to go to her office. We have to get down on our hands and knees and beg the daughter we threw away." Less than 2 hours later, the tranquil, hushed atmosphere of my private residential high-rise was violently interrupted. I lived in the penthouse of the Sovereign, a hyper-exclusive glass tower where the security was tighter than a Federal Reserve Bank. The lobby was a masterpiece of minimalist design, featuring imported black marble brushed titanium pillars and a concierge desk staffed by former elite military personnel. It was a fortress designed to keep the chaos of the city at bay, but desperation has a way of breaching even the strongest walls. My head of personal security, a towering man named Vance, tapped his earpiece as I sat in my home office reviewing the final asset seizure documents. He looked at me with a perfectly neutral expression. "We have a situation in the main lobby, Madam CEO," Vance stated quietly. "Two women claiming to be your mother and sister have bypassed the outer gate by tailgating a delivery truck. They are currently screaming at the concierge and demanding immediate access to the private elevator. Shall I have the local authorities arrest them for trespassing?" I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet penthouse. The time had come for the final curtain call. "No, Vance," I replied, standing up and smoothing the front of my tailored trousers. "I will handle this personally. Have the lobby locked down. No one comes in or out until I say so." I stepped into the private express elevator, flanked by Vance and two other heavily armed security contractors. The descent felt incredibly slow, building the anticipation of the final pathetic act of the Barrett family drama. The polished steel doors slid silently open, revealing a scene of absolute, unadulterated desperation. Patricia and Melanie looked like they had been dragged through a hurricane. Patricia's carefully styled hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and stained. Melanie was clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, her chest heaving with theatrical, gasping sobs as she pleaded with the stone-faced concierge. Patricia shrieked the absolute second she saw me step out of the elevator. She lunged forward, but Vance and his team instantly formed a human wall of solid muscle and tailored suits, easily blocking her path. Patricia crashed against them, falling to her knees on the cold, black marble floor. She did not try to stand back up. Instead, she crawled forward on her hands and knees, tears streaming down her ruined face, perfectly executing the desperate, humiliating maneuver she had planned. "Please, Cassie!" Patricia wailed, her voice echoing shrilly off the titanium pillars. "You have to listen to me. Your father is a monster. He is a criminal. I had absolutely no idea he was committing fraud. I had no idea he was using our beautiful home as collateral. You know I am just a traditional wife. I never looked at the finances. He lied to me just like he lied to you. You cannot punish me for his horrific crimes." I stared down at the woman who had spent 2 decades treating me like a contagious disease. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I just let her pathetic cries fill the immaculate lobby. Melanie scrambled forward, kneeling right beside her mother, her hands clasped together in a desperate prayer. "Cassidy, look at us. We have absolutely nothing. The credit cards are declining. The bank accounts are frozen. Richard is barricaded in his office, drinking himself into a stupor, and the federal investigators are already swarming the estate gates. We are your family. You are a billionaire. You have a massive empire. You cannot let your own mother and sister sleep on the streets. Just give us a small stipend. Just let us keep the house. We will do anything you want." I looked at Melanie taking in her ruined designer dress and her bloodshot, terrified eyes. The arrogance that had defined her entire existence was completely erased. "You still do not understand, Melanie," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I do not want your apologies. I do not want your fake sisterly affection. I want you to feel exactly what I felt when you drained my college fund to pay for your ridiculous wedding. I want you to feel the exact same sheer suffocating terror I felt when you threw me out of the house with nothing but a trash bag full of clothes." Patricia saw the absolute zero tolerance in my eyes and instantly realized that appealing to family loyalty was a completely dead end. The survival instinct that had driven her to this lobby kicked into its final, most venomous gear. She looked at her golden child, the daughter she had worshipped and protected at my expense, and made a ruthless calculation. "I will cut her off!" Patricia suddenly screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at Melanie. Melanie gasped, her eyes widening in absolute shock as she turned to look at her mother. "I will disown Melanie right now," Patricia declared, her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch. "She is toxic, Cassie. She is spoiled and arrogant, and her husband ruined the entire company. She is the reason your father stole your tuition money. She demanded that wedding. She demanded the luxury cars. I tried to stop them, Cassie. I swear I did. I will divorce your father tomorrow morning. I will testify against him in federal court. I will give the SEC everything they need to lock him away for the rest of his life. Just save me. Just give me a small allowance and let me live in the guest house on the estate. Please, Cassie. I am your mother. You do not need to help them, but you have to save me." The silence that followed was absolute. The security guards did not move. The concierge stared straight ahead. I simply stood there watching the ultimate betrayal unfold exactly as I had predicted it would. Melanie stared at Patricia, her mouth hanging open. The illusion of her perfect, loving mother shattered into a million jagged pieces on the black marble floor. Patricia had not just thrown her under the bus. She had backed the bus up and run over her again just to secure a guest house. "You vile, selfish witch!" Melanie shrieked, her voice tearing through the lobby like a siren. Melanie lunged at Patricia, tackling her own mother to the marble floor. They rolled in a tangle of designer fabrics and flailing limbs, screaming absolute obscenities at each other. Melanie slapped Patricia across the face, screaming that Patricia was a gold digger who had enabled Richard's fraud for decades. Patricia clawed at Melanie's hair, shrieking that Melanie was a useless, ungrateful parasite who had dragged the family name into the gutter by marrying a pathetic embezzler. They tore at each other like feral, starving animals fighting over the last scrap of meat. There was absolutely zero loyalty, zero love, and zero family bond left. They were completely hollow, driven only by greed and an instinct to survive at any cost. Vance stepped forward, his hand hovering over his radio. "Should we separate them, Madam CEO?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the brawl. I looked down at the two women rolling on the floor, tearing their own family legacy to shreds. They were finally exposing the exact monsters they had always been. But this time, I was not their victim. I was simply the audience. "No, Vance," I replied, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "Let them finish their conversation. When they are done, escort them off my property. If they resist, have them arrested for assault and trespassing." I did not wait for a response. I did not look back at the screaming, thrashing remnants of the Barrett family. I simply turned my back, walked into the private elevator, and pressed the button for the penthouse, leaving them exactly where they belonged, at the absolute bottom. 72 hours evaporate quickly when you are desperately clinging to a dying illusion. By Monday morning, the heavy iron gates of the Barrett estate were thrown wide open, but not for a charity gala. A fleet of massive industrial moving trucks idled on the pristine cobblestone driveway, their diesel engines rumbling like a death knell for my family's stolen legacy. I arrived just after dawn, stepping out of my sleek black SUV into the crisp morning air to personally oversee the transition. I wanted to witness the exact moment the Barrett Empire officially ceased to exist. The sweeping front lawns, usually manicured to absolute perfection, were trampled by burly men hauling out the physical evidence of Richard and Patricia's vanity. Priceless antique vases, imported Renaissance tapestries, and absurdly expensive modern art pieces were being unceremoniously catalogued, wrapped in cheap plastic, and loaded into the trucks. These items would be auctioned off by the end of the month to satisfy the remaining corporate debt. The demolition crews were already staging their heavy equipment near the guest house. Their bright yellow hard hats, a stark, jarring contrast to the elegant Georgian architecture. I stood on the porch and listened to the rhythmic thud of furniture being dismantled. It was the sweetest symphony I had ever heard. I walked up the grand marble steps and into the echoing foyer. The atmosphere was completely devoid of its usual arrogant warmth. Patricia and Melanie were barely speaking to each other. Ever since their spectacular, vicious brawl in the lobby of my corporate headquarters, the fragile alliance of the Barrett women had entirely disintegrated. Melanie sat on a plastic crate near the front door, nursing a bruised cheek and a split lip, her designer clothes replaced by generic stained sweatpants. She looked at her mother with pure venom. Patricia paced the empty dining room, frantically barking orders at movers who completely ignored her. She tried to grab a silver candelabra from a worker's hands, screaming that it was a family heirloom, only to be politely but firmly rebuffed by my security team. They had no authority left. They were just trespassers waiting to be evicted. But it was Richard who truly embodied the catastrophic reality of their new existence. I found my father standing in his former study, a room once lined with leather-bound books and the unmistakable scent of expensive cigars and unchecked power. Now the mahogany shelves were completely bare. The Persian rugs had been rolled up and hauled away. Richard stood in the center of the stripped room, holding a single flimsy cardboard box. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in a single weekend. The aggressive, booming patriarch who had ruthlessly dictated my life was gone. His shoulders were slumped, his tailored suit hung loosely on his suddenly frail frame, and the arrogant flush of color had permanently drained from his face. He was packing the last of his personal desk items, a handful of cheap pens, a cracked leather notepad, and a single unframed photograph of himself shaking hands with a politician. It was all he was legally allowed to take. Everything else belonged to Vanguard Logistics. I knew exactly where that cardboard box was going. They were not moving into a slightly smaller suburban home or a respectable downtown condo. Their frozen assets and pending federal indictments meant absolutely nobody in their elite circle would touch them. They were headed to a cramped, squalid two-bedroom apartment in the industrial district, a neighborhood notorious for high crime rates, failing plumbing, and crumbling infrastructure. The irony was spectacular. The man who had thrown me onto the streets with absolutely nothing was now facing the harsh, unforgiving reality of the exact same concrete pavement. I leaned casually against the doorframe of the study, letting the silence stretch until the sheer weight of my presence forced him to look up. Richard slowly raised his head. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were dull, bloodshot, and utterly defeated. He looked at me, taking in my immaculate tailored suit, the confident posture, the absolute control I held over his destiny. He did not yell. He did not threaten me with lawyers he could no longer afford. He simply clutched his pathetic cardboard box tighter to his chest, his knuckles turning white. "Why?" Cassidy Richard rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across pavement. He swallowed hard, struggling to force the words out of his dry throat. "You won. You bought the debt. You exposed the fraud. You completely destroyed my reputation. You proved you are smarter and more ruthless than I ever gave you credit for. But why could you not just fire us? Why did you have to strip the estate? Why take the house, the accounts, the absolute last shred of our dignity? Why take everything?" I slowly crossed the empty room, my heels clicking sharply against the bare hardwood floor, the sound echoing off the bare walls. I stopped just inches from him, invading his personal space, forcing him to confront the daughter he had tried to erase. "You threw me away to protect an illusion, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You stole my college fund. You destroyed my future, and you lied to my face to massage Melanie's fragile ego. You told me I was a failure. You called me a freeloader. You said I lacked the predatory instinct to survive in the real world. I did not take everything just to punish you. I took everything to show you exactly how well I learned the lessons you taught me. You built a kingdom on lies, and I simply reclaimed the bricks." Richard closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his weathered gray cheek. He let out a ragged, defeated breath, shifting the weight of the box in his arms, preparing to walk past me and out of the mansion forever. He thought this was the end. He thought he was walking away to face the federal investigators as an unemployed, ruined, and discarded man. I reached out and firmly placed my hand flat against the center of his cardboard box, stopping him dead in his tracks. Richard opened his eyes, staring at me in confusion, a flicker of panic returning to his features. I offered him a cold, razor-sharp smile. "I'm not firing you, Richard," I stated with absolute chilling finality. "You still work for me." Richard's breath hitched. He blinked, his mind struggling to process the impossible contradiction of my words. He looked around the empty, stripped study, then back at me, a pathetic spark of desperate, misplaced hope flaring in his bloodshot eyes. "You want me to stay on?" he croaked, his voice cracking under the strain. "As a consultant, an advisory role during the transition, I can help you navigate the European supply chain, Cassidy. I know the vendors. I know the exact executives you need to appease." I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that echoed off the bare mahogany walls, completely devoid of any familial warmth. I gestured to Vance, who stepped forward holding a thin, cheap manila folder. It was a stark, intentional contrast to the heavy gold-sealed leather binders I had used to dismantle him in the boardroom. I took the folder and slapped it against Richard's chest, forcing him to drop his cardboard box to catch the paper before it hit the floor. "Open it," I commanded. Richard fumbled with the cheap paper, his hands trembling violently. He pulled out a single double-sided document printed on standard low-grade copy paper. He scanned the top lines, his brow furrowing in deep, profound confusion. He read the words aloud, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "Employment contract. Vanguard Logistics Subsidiary Branch. Position Night Shift Warehouse Logistics Supervisor." He looked up at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, humiliated rage. "A warehouse supervisor. You expect me, Richard Barrett, a man who built a global distribution empire, to supervise forklift drivers in a corrugated metal box. I expect you to earn your keep?" I replied smoothly, crossing my arms and looking down at him. You are permanently stripped of your CEO title, your executive privileges, your corner office, and your corporate expense accounts. You will report to Sector 4 in the Industrial Park at 10 o'clock every evening. You will wear a high-visibility vest. You will oversee the loading docks until 6 in the morning. You get one 15-minute break per shift, and you will do it for the state-mandated minimum wage. Richard crushed the contract in his fist, throwing it onto the floor with a sudden burst of pathetic defiance. I will never sign that. I will find private investors. I will start a new firm. I will not be your indentured servant. I did not raise my voice. I simply stepped closer, letting the absolute, inescapable reality of his situation crash down on him. With what capital, Richard? Your personal accounts are seized. Your corporate accounts belong to me. The Securities and Exchange Commission has frozen your retirement funds, your offshore trusts, and every single liquid asset bearing the Barrett name while they investigate the catastrophic fraud you authorized. You have absolutely zero pension. You have zero savings. You are being evicted from this estate today, and you do not have enough cash in your pocket to rent a motel room. I leaned in, making sure he felt the full suffocating weight of my words. You introduced me to your friends as a worthless freeloader. You told the entire country club that I lacked the work ethic to survive in the real world. Now you are going to prove you aren't one. You will clock in at 10 p.m. You will sweep the floors, or you will starve. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving rapidly. The fight completely drained out of him, replaced by the crushing, terrifying realization of his absolute poverty. He slowly sank to his knees, his joints popping loudly in the quiet, empty room. He reached out with shaking, liver-spotted hands, picked up the crumpled contract, and tried to smooth it out against his thigh. Vance silently stepped forward and handed him a cheap plastic pen. With a jagged, uneven stroke, the mighty Richard Barrett signed away the very last shred of his dignity. Just as the ink dried, a loud, dramatic wail echoed from the hallway. Melanie stumbled into the study, her face streaked with ruined makeup. She had clearly been listening from the corridor. She looked at her father kneeling on the floor, then turned her desperate, pleading eyes to me. "Cassie, please," Melanie begged, wringing her hands together so hard her knuckles turned white. "You cannot do this to us. I am your sister. I was vice president of marketing. I have an MBA. I can run your public relations department. I can salvage the family brand. Just give me an executive role. I will work under you. I promise I will be good." I looked at the woman who had happily drained my college tuition to fund her lavish, fraudulent wedding. I snapped my fingers. My assistant, standing quietly near the doorway, stepped forward and handed me a small, clear plastic bag. Inside was a cheap, foam-padded telemarketing headset. I held it out by the cord, letting it dangle in front of Melanie's horrified face. Vanguard Logistics is absorbing a massive influx of incredibly angry vendors who have not been paid by Barrett Distribution in over 6 months. I explained, my tone clinical and detached. We need frontline customer service representatives to field the verbal abuse. You will be sitting in a gray 3x3 cubicle on the ground floor of our call center. You are stripped of your vice president title. You are stripped of your corporate credit card. You will answer a minimum of 120 calls per shift, reading from a pre-approved script, apologizing for the massive incompetence of your own family. Melanie recoiled as if the headset were a venomous snake. A call center. I cannot work in a call center. I do not do peasant work. I am a Barrett. My friends will see me. The Barrett name is currently synonymous with federal wire fraud and bankruptcy, I stated flatly, dropping the plastic bag onto the floor at her feet. You have 2 choices, Melanie. You can pick up that headset, clock in at 8 tomorrow morning, and earn minimum wage. Or you can walk out those front doors with nothing but the clothes on your back and try to explain your total lack of applicable skills to a hiring manager who just watched your husband get indicted for grand embezzlement. Melanie stared down at the cheap plastic headset, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked at her father, who was still kneeling on the bare floor, clutching his warehouse contract. She looked at the bare walls of the mansion she used to rule. The reality of her situation finally breached her narcissistic delusion. She had no husband to bail her out. She had no mother to manipulate. She had absolutely no one. With a wretched, humiliating sob, Melanie slowly bent down and picked up the plastic bag. I stood over them perfectly composed, absorbing the spectacular silence of their defeat. The mighty had finally truly fallen. They were not just broken. They were tethered to the very bottom of the empire I now controlled. 6 months dissolved the very last remnants of the Barrett family legacy into absolute dust. The toxic foundation they had built over decades had been completely eradicated, and in its place, Vanguard Logistics stood as an undisputed, impenetrable global monolith. The grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel was a sea of glittering crystal chandeliers, imported white orchids, and the most ruthlessly successful minds in the international market. I stood just behind the heavy velvet curtain of the main stage, listening to the low, thrumming hum of the elite crowd. Tonight was the apex of my corporate conquest. The National Commerce Board was hosting their annual gala, and I was the guest of honor. I smoothed the front of my tailored emerald gown, taking a slow, measured breath. The atmosphere was electric. These were the exact same industry titans, politicians, and socialites who used to drink Richard's expensive champagne and laugh at his arrogant jokes. Now they were sitting in a ballroom that I had paid for, waiting to applaud the woman he had discarded. The presenter, a veteran titan of the tech industry, stepped up to the podium. His voice boomed through the massive speakers. This year's recipient has redefined aggressive market expansion, the presenter announced, the crowd falling into a reverent hush. She took a fractured, failing distribution network and forged it into a global powerhouse in record time. She represents the absolute pinnacle of modern corporate leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, your businesswoman of the year, Cassidy Barrett. The applause was absolutely deafening. It roared through the ballroom like a tidal wave. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtain and walked into the blinding glare of the spotlights. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, terrifying confidence of a predator that had finally conquered the entire jungle. I reached the podium and accepted the heavy etched glass trophy. I looked out over the standing ovation, locking eyes with competitors, investors, and former allies of my father. They were all looking up at me. I offered a brief, perfectly calibrated speech about resilience, forward momentum, and the absolute necessity of cutting out dead corporate weight to achieve visionary growth. I owned the room completely. After the ceremony concluded, the real trial began. The press scrum was waiting in the grand foyer. Flashbulbs erupted in a blinding strobe effect, and dozens of microphones were thrust in my direction as I descended the grand staircase, flanked by Vance and my security detail. Miss Barrett. A reporter from a major financial network pushed her way to the front of the barricade. Your rise to the absolute top of the logistics sector has been unprecedented. Given your family's historical, albeit controversial ties to this industry, how important was your family's support in your journey to the top? The entire foyer went dead silent. The flashing cameras temporarily paused. Everyone knew the scandalous rumors regarding the hostile takeover of Barrett Distribution, but nobody had ever dared to ask me about it directly on camera. I stopped walking. I turned slowly, locking my gaze directly into the red recording light of the primary television camera. I did not blink. I did not offer a polite corporate smile. I let the absolute zero tolerance in my eyes broadcast to millions of viewers. I didn't have a family, I stated, my voice echoing coldly through the marble foyer. I built my empire with my own 2 hands. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. A collective audible gasp rippled through the press corps. The reporters scrambled, shouting follow-up questions, completely desperate to capitalize on the brutal soundbite. I did not look back. I turned on my heel and walked out the heavy glass doors into the cool night air, leaving the media frenzy perfectly orchestrated in my wake. Miles away, far beyond the glittering city skyline and the manicured wealth of the elite districts, the atmosphere was entirely different. Sector 4 of the Vanguard Logistics Industrial Park was a brutal, unforgiving environment. It was a massive corrugated metal cavern that smelled perpetually of diesel fumes, damp concrete, and cheap burnt coffee. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the freezing draft biting through the loading dock doors was merciless. Richard Barrett stood near Bay 12. He was wearing a stained, oversized, high-visibility vest over a faded thermal shirt. His liver-spotted hands, which used to wear a solid gold Rolex and sign multi-million-dollar contracts, were now wrapped tightly around the wooden handle of a heavy industrial push broom. His back ached with a constant grinding agony, his knees popped loudly every time he took a step. The aggressive, booming patriarch who had ruthlessly ruled a mansion was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, broken man who flinched every time the shift manager yelled over the intercom. The loud, shrill buzzer echoed through the warehouse, signaling the mandatory 15-minute break for the night crew. Richard let out a ragged, exhausted sigh. He leaned the broom against a stack of wooden pallets and shuffled slowly toward the employee break room. The room was painfully depressing. It was illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent tube that buzzed like an angry hornet. The linoleum floor was sticky. Richard slumped into a cracked plastic chair, his joints screaming in protest, and stared blankly at the stained wall. He had absolutely nothing. No savings, no pension, no home. Melanie was working the phones in a cubicle farm across town, and Patricia had filed for a ruthless, highly publicized divorce the exact second the bank accounts were seized. In the corner of the break room, mounted precariously on a metal bracket, a small, cheap television was playing the late-night financial news recap. The volume was low, fighting against the constant rumble of forklifts outside. Richard slowly raised his head. The staticky screen flashed, displaying the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. The image cut to the press scrum, and there she was, Cassidy. She looked absolutely magnificent, draped in emerald silk, radiating an aura of total untouchable power. Richard leaned forward, his bloodshot eyes widening as he watched the daughter he had thrown away command the attention of the entire world. The camera zoomed in on her face just as the reporter asked the question about family support. Richard held his breath. He watched as Cassidy stared directly into the lens. He watched her lips move. He heard the faint, staticky audio deliver the ultimate crushing blow. "I didn't have a family. I built my empire with my own 2 hands. Sometimes the trash takes itself out." The broadcast cut back to the shocked news anchors, but Richard did not see them. He stared at the flickering screen, the words echoing relentlessly in his empty, ruined mind. There were no lawyers to call. There were no accounts to manipulate. There was no escape. The absolute reality of his complete destruction finally settled heavily onto his tired shoulders. He was exactly what he had always accused her of being: worthless. The 15-minute buzzer shrieked violently through the break room, demanding his return to the concrete floor. Richard Barrett closed his eyes for one long, pathetic second. He slowly lowered his head, staring down at his blistered, filthy hands. He pushed himself out of the plastic chair, shuffled back out into the freezing, diesel-choked warehouse, picked up his heavy broom, and went back to sweeping the dirt off his daughter's floor. The story of this triumph over an abusive family teaches a profound lesson about resilience and true worth. For years, the father and sister diminished her value, projecting their toxic insecurities onto her. Cassidy completely refused to accept their false narrative. Instead of crumbling under betrayal, she quietly built her own massive empire from the ground up. The ultimate revenge was not just stripping them of unearned wealth. It was proving that true power comes from deep inner belief. When toxic people try to bury you, use the dirt to grow. Please share your own empowering experiences and comment below.